Tonight we're going to explore one of the oldest and most mysterious houses in all of Westeros, a family whose history stretches back into the mists of the Age of Heroes, long before the Andals crossed the Narrow Sea, long before even the written word came to Dawn. We'll journey to Starfall, an ancient castle perched on an island where the Torrentine meets the summer sea, and we'll discover the story of House Dayne, the fallen star that became a sword, and the knights who bore that blade across thousands of years. We'll contemplate what it means when legend and history intertwine so completely that separating them becomes impossible and perhaps unnecessary. By the end, I think you'll understand why this house, though never kings, though never rulers of all Dawn, has captured the imagination of maesters and common folk alike for millennia. So settle in, let your shoulders drop, take a slow breath, and let it move through you. There's nowhere you need to be, nothing you need to remember. Just listen, and let the story of the morning star unfold before you like a banner catching the first light of dawn. Before we can understand House Dayne as it exists in history, we need to drift back much further, back to a time when the world was younger and stranger, when magic was more common, and the distinction between myth and truth was far less clear than it would become in later ages. We need to travel back to the Age of Heroes, that long period stretching from roughly 8,000 to 6,000 years before Aegon's conquest. A time so distant that almost nothing is known with certainty, where every story has been filtered through thousands of years of telling and retelling, where fact and legend have merged into something that might be more true than either alone. The world of the Age of Heroes was fundamentally different from the Westeros we've come to know through later history. The first men, who had crossed the land bridge from Essos thousands of years before, were still the dominant people throughout the continent. They had made their peace with the children of the forest after long years of war, and they worshipped the old gods in the weirwood groves, carving faces into the pale trees and listening for the whispers of the earth itself. The Andals had not yet come with their seven-pointed star and their steel and their faith. The Seven Kingdoms did not exist. Instead, there were countless petty kingdoms, each ruling over territories that might be as small as a single valley, or as large as several modern regions combined. In Dawn, during this ancient time, the political landscape was as fractured as anywhere else in Westeros. Numerous First Men kingdoms rose and fell, their names and deeds lost to history. The harsh environment of Dawn, with its deserts and mountains and the burning sun that gave the region its name, created a people who were hard and practical, who valued water above gold and shade above castles. It was into this world that House Dayne emerged, though the exact circumstances of their founding are wrapped in legend and mystery. The story, as it has been passed down through countless generations, speaks of a star that fell from the sky in the dawn of days. This was not a figurative or poetic falling star, not a streak of light across the night sky that disappeared in moments, but rather something substantial, something that struck the earth with such force that it left a mark upon the land itself. Some versions of the tale say it fell into the Torrentine River, others that it struck the earth near where Starfall would later be built, still others that it landed in the mountains and was discovered by hunters. The accounts vary in their details, as ancient stories always do, but they agree on the essential fact. Something came from the sky, something that was not of this earth. What likely happened, if we strip away the mythic elements and consider the matter with the eyes of a maester trained in natural philosophy, is that a meteorite struck the earth somewhere in the region that would become the Dane lands. Such events are rare but not unknown. The Maesters of the Citadel have documented several instances across recorded history of stones falling from the sky, though most are small and cause little notice. This one, if it existed as the legends claim, must have been substantial, large enough to be recovered and worked, large enough to provide material for what would become the most famous sword in Westerosi history. The legends say that the first Danes, whose names are lost to us now, found this fallen star and recognised it as a gift from the gods, though which gods exactly is unclear, as this was before the faith of the Seven reached dawn, and the exact nature of first men worship varied from region to region. They took this celestial metal, this substance that was unlike anything found in the earth itself, and they worked it, shaped it, forged it into a blade. How they managed this is one of the great mysteries, for the maesters tell us that meteoritic iron is notoriously difficult to work, requiring great heat and skill, and the first men of that era, while capable craftsmen, did not have the sophisticated metallurgical knowledge that would come later with the Andals, or that had existed in ancient Valyria. Perhaps the tale of the forging is itself embellished. Perhaps the sword was made much later, using metal salvaged from an earlier, simpler working of the fallen star. Perhaps there were craftsmen of exceptional skill whose names have not survived. Perhaps, and this is the explanation that appeals most to those who see magic in the world, there was something about the star metal itself that made it workable in ways that ordinary iron was not, that it contained some quality or power that allowed it to be shaped by heat and will into the blade that would become dawn. The sword itself, according to all accounts both ancient and modern, is unlike any other blade in Westeros. Most great swords are made of Valyrian steel, that magical metal forged in the fires of the Freehold before the Doom, smoky dark and impossibly sharp, holding an edge that never dulls, and bearing patterns in the metal like flowing water or dancing flames. Dawn is not like these blades. It is described as pale as milk glass, alive with light, appearing almost white or silver depending on how the light strikes it. Some who have seen it say it glows with its own faint luminescence, particularly in the presence of its rightful wielder, though this might be poetic exaggeration or the play of light on unusual metal. What is certain is that Dawn has existed for thousands of years, has been passed down through the Dayne family from the Age of Heroes, through all the long ages that followed, and has maintained its edge and its beauty despite the passage of millennia. This longevity alone suggests that there was something extraordinary about its making, about the materials used, about the craft that went into its creation. Whether that extraordinary quality came from the heavens or from human skill is perhaps less important than the fact that it exists, that it has been preserved, that it has become a symbol not just of a house, but of an ideal. The early Danes, having created or acquired this remarkable blade, used it to carve out a kingdom in Western Dawn. They built Starfall on an island at the mouth of the Torrentine River, a strategic location that controlled river traffic and sea access both, that could be easily defended and that provided access to the fertile lands along the Torrentine as well as to the sea lanes of the Summer Sea. The castle they built was substantial, though whether the current structure dates to this ancient time or has been rebuilt and expanded over the millennia is unclear. What matters is that Starfall became their seat, their centre of power, the place where Dawn was kept when it was not being carried to war. The first men Danes ruled as petty kings over the land surrounding Starfall, though the exact extent of their kingdom is unknown. They likely controlled a territory that extended up the Torrentine Valley, perhaps including parts of the Red Mountains, certainly including the coastal areas north and south of the river mouth. They would have had rivals and enemies, other petty kings who disputed boundaries and resources, who raided and were raided in turn, who sometimes were defeated and sometimes absorbed parts of Dane lands. This was the nature of the Age of Heroes, constant small-scale warfare punctuated by temporary alliances and occasional grand campaigns. But the Danes distinguished themselves from other petty kingdoms through the institution that would become their defining characteristic, the title and role that would make them memorable across the ages. They established the tradition of the Sword of the Morning, though it might not have been called that in the earliest days. The concept was simple, but profound. Dawn would not simply be passed from lord to heir like an ordinary heirloom. Instead, It would be wielded only by those members of House Dayne who proved themselves worthy through exceptional skill and character. Not every Lord of Starfall would bear Dawn. The sword would choose its bearer, or rather, the house would determine who among them had earned the right to carry this blade that had fallen from the stars. This tradition set House Dayne apart from the beginning. Most great houses passed their treasures down through bloodlines, from father to son, regardless of the worthiness of the recipient. The Danes established something different, a meritocracy of honour within their own family. It meant that Dawn might sometimes go to a younger son, or a daughter, or a cousin, or a nephew, whoever proved themselves most capable, most skilled, most noble in character. It meant that sometimes, in darker ages, or in times when House Dayne was weak or its members young, Dawn might rest in the castle, waiting for a worthy wielder to emerge. The first swords of the morning, those ancient knights whose names are lost to us now, established the reputation that would endure for thousands of years. They were not merely skilled warriors, though they certainly were that. They were paragons of the qualities that the first men valued. Courage in battle, yes, but also loyalty to their people, justice in their judgments, mercy when mercy was warranted, the willingness to defend the weak and uphold their oaths regardless of personal cost. These ideals, which would later be formalized in the Andal tradition of knighthood, were already present in the First Men culture, already valued and pursued by those who sought to be remembered as heroes. The Age of Heroes, we should remember, was called that for a reason. It was a time when larger-than-life figures seemed to stride across the world, when great deeds were performed and great houses were founded. We hear of Bran the Builder constructing the wall in Winterfell and Storm's End, of Lan the clever winning Casterly Rock through trickery, of Garth Greenhand whose descendants would rule the Reach, of Durin Godsgrief who defied the gods themselves to build his castle. Whether these figures were real in the form we remember them, whether their deeds were as magnificent as the stories claim, we cannot know with certainty. But we can know that the Age of Heroes was a time of foundation, when the great houses that would endure for thousands of years were establishing themselves, when traditions were being created that would outlast kingdoms and religions and dragons themselves. House Dayne was among these ancient foundations, perhaps not as widely celebrated as some, perhaps not ruling as large a territory as houses that would become the great kingdoms, but establishing something equally enduring, a tradition of honour and martial excellence, embodied in a blade that had fallen from the sky. They were building not just a castle or a kingdom, but an ideal, a standard against which knights would be measured for thousands of years to come. In those early days, the Danes would have fought countless battles whose details are lost to history. They would have defended their lands against raiders from the sea, against rival kingdoms from the mountains, against whoever sought to take what they had built. They would have forged alliances through marriage, through shared enemies, through the complex web of obligations and kinship that bound the First Men nobility together. They would have sent their sons to foster with other houses, and received the sons of other houses in return, building networks of loyalty that would outlast any individual lifetime. The Torrentine River would have been the lifeblood of their kingdom, providing water in a land where water was precious, providing a route for trade and transportation, providing fertile land along its banks where crops could grow even in Dawn's harsh climate. The Danes would have cultivated these riverlands, would have built villages and water wheels and irrigation works, would have encouraged craftsmen and merchants to settle under their protection. They would have built ships to sail the summer sea, trading with other coastal settlements, perhaps even venturing as far as the Arbor or the Reach or down the coast, toward the lands that would one day be called the Summer Isles. And always, through all of this, there would have been dawn. The blade would have been carried by each sword of the morning into battle, would have been displayed at feasts and celebrations, would have been used to dispense justice and defend the weak. Each wielder would have added to its legend, would have performed deeds that would be remembered and retold, would have embodied the qualities that made a true sword of the morning. The blade would have become more than just a weapon. It would have become a symbol of the house itself, of its values and its history, of the fallen star that marked it as special among the petty kingdoms of the first men. We can imagine, on quiet nights at Starfall during those ancient times, the sword of the morning standing on the battlements, looking out over the Torrentine as it flowed toward the sea, holding dawn and watching the stars wheel overhead. Perhaps they wondered about the star that had fallen, about what it had been before it struck the earth, about whether the gods had sent it for a purpose, or whether it was merely chance that brought it to dawn, to the lands that would become Dayne territory. Perhaps they saw themselves as guardians of something that did not quite belong to the mortal world, something that had come from the realm of the gods, or from the void between the stars, something that carried with it responsibilities beyond merely ruling a kingdom or winning battles. This sense of cosmic significance, of being connected to something larger than the petty concerns of human kingdoms, would become woven into House Dayne's identity. They were not just another noble house, not just another group of lords ruling over a territory. They were the keepers of the morning star, the wielders of a blade that had fallen from the sky, the guardians of an ancient tradition that connected earth and heaven. Mortal skill and divine providence. This identity would sustain them through the changes that were coming, through the invasions and upheavals that would transform Westeros, through the rise and fall of kingdoms and religions and dragons. But for now, in those distant days of the Age of Heroes, House Dayne was establishing itself, building the foundation that would support them for thousands of years. They were creating traditions that would outlast them, forging an identity that would remain recognizable even as the world changed beyond recognition around them. They were taking a fallen star and making it into something that would never truly fall, that would continue to shine across the long ages of history, a light in the darkness, a standard of honour in a world that often seemed to have too little of it. And so the Age of Heroes gave way to the long centuries that followed, but House Dayne endured, and dawn remained at Starfall, waiting for those who would prove themselves worthy to bear it, a blade of starlight in a world of iron and blood. The world that House Dayne had known for thousands of years, the world of the first men with their weirwood gods and their ancient ways, was not destined to remain unchanged forever. Across the narrow sea, in the lands of Essos, a great migration was beginning, a movement of peoples that would transform Westeros as completely as any event in its long history. The Andals, driven by religious fervour and hunger for land, were crossing the sea in their thousands, bringing with them iron weapons, the faith of the Seven, and a determination to conquer the lands of the first men and make them their own. The Andal invasion began roughly 6,000 years before Aegon's conquest, landing first in the Vale of Arryn, then spreading throughout the eastern kingdoms of Westeros. It was not a single coordinated campaign, but rather waves of migration and conquest spread over thousands of years, with different Andal warlords carving out their own kingdoms, intermarrying with First Men nobility when it suited them, destroying the old houses when resistance was offered. The children of the forest were driven from their last strongholds in the eastern lands, the weirwood groves were cut down and burned, the First Men kingdoms fell one by one, and the faith of the Seven replaced the old gods throughout most of the continent. But Dawn, as it has done so often throughout its history, proved exceptional. The Andals who came to Dawn found a very different reception than those who had conquered the Vale, or the Riverlands, or the Reach. The Desert Kingdom was harsh and unforgiving to invaders who did not know its ways, who did not understand how to find water in the waste or how to fight in the burning sun. The Dornish First Men, hardened by their environment and united in their determination to preserve their independence, fought the Andals to a standstill in many regions. The conquest of Dawn was slower, more difficult, and ultimately less complete than anywhere else in Westeros. House Dayne, ruling from their island fortress at Starfall, faced a choice that would determine their survival or destruction. They could resist the Andal tide as many First Men houses did, fighting to preserve their ancient ways and their independence, likely being destroyed in the process. Or they could adapt, could find a way to accommodate the newcomers while preserving their essential identity, could transform themselves to meet the changing world while maintaining the core of what made them House Dayne. It was a choice between purity and survival, between holding fast to tradition and evolving to meet new circumstances. The exact details of how House Dayne navigated this transition are lost to the mists of time, buried in the thousands of years that separate those events from the present day. But we can piece together a general picture from the outcome, from the fact that House Dayne not only survived the Andal invasion, but thrived in its aftermath, that they maintained their hold on Starfall and the Torrentine Valley, that Dawn continued to be passed down through their line, that the tradition of the Sword of the Morning endured even as so much else changed around them. What likely happened, what makes sense given what we know of House Dayne's character and the circumstances of Dawn's conquest, is that the Danes adopted a strategy of selective adaptation. They were willing to compromise on matters that did not touch the core of their identity, while holding firm on those traditions that defined who they were. This was not weakness or betrayal of their First Men heritage, but rather wisdom, the kind of pragmatic flexibility that allows ancient institutions to survive when more rigid structures shatter and fall. The faith of the Seven came to Dawn, and House Dayne, it seems, embraced it, or at least accepted it. They built septs on their lands, they allowed septons to preach the seven-pointed star, they themselves took on the outward forms of the new religion. This was a significant change, a break with thousands of years of First Men tradition. The weirwood groves where their ancestors had worshipped were likely cut down or fell into disuse, though perhaps some remained in remote areas, maintained by those who could not quite let go of the old gods. The faces carved in the pale bark were left to weather and fade, the whispered prayers to nameless gods fell silent, replaced by hymns to the father and the mother, the warrior and the maiden, the smith and the crone and the stranger. But this adoption of the new faith, while real, didn't erase what made House Dayne unique. They kept Dawn, they kept the tradition of the Sword of the Morning, they kept their ancient seat at Starfall and their rule over the Torrentine Valley. They kept their identity as one of the oldest houses in Westeros, one that could trace its lineage back to the Age of Heroes, back to the time when a star fell from the sky and became a blade. The faith of the Seven might govern their outward religious practice, but the fallen star remained at the heart of who they were. This kind of cultural synthesis, this blending of old and new, was characteristic of Dawn's response to the Andal invasion. Unlike the other kingdoms where the First Men were largely displaced or absorbed, where their culture was suppressed or forgotten, Dawn maintained more of its ancient character, even as it integrated Andal elements. The result was a unique culture, one that combined First Men toughness and connection to the land with Andal religion and military technology, creating something that was neither purely one nor the other, but distinctly Dawnish. House Dayne likely intermarried with Andal nobility, taking Andal wives or sending Dane daughters to marry into Andal houses, creating bonds of kinship that helped smooth the integration of the two peoples. These marriages would have brought new blood into House Dayne, new names and new traditions, but the core identity, the connection to the fallen star and the ancient seat at Starfall, remained constant. The house that emerged from this period of transition was changed, certainly, but it was still recognisably House Dayne, still the Keepers of Dawn, still the family that produced Swords of the Morning. The military technology of the Andals, particularly their superior ironworking, would have been eagerly adopted. The Andals brought knowledge of how to forge better steel, how to create more effective armour and weapons. House Dayne, with their ancient tradition of metalcraft dating back to the forging of Dawn itself, would have been particularly interested in these new techniques. Their smiths would have learned from Andal craftsmen, combining the old knowledge with the new, creating works that honoured both traditions. The castle at Starfall might have been expanded and strengthened during this period, incorporating Andal architectural innovations while maintaining its essential character as an island fortress. The institution of knighthood, which the Andals brought with them, and which would become central to Westerosi culture, must have resonated deeply with House Dayne. The values that knighthood celebrated, courage and loyalty, honour and service, protection of the weak and defence of the faith. These were not foreign to the Danes. They had been embodying these ideals for thousands of years through the tradition of the Sword of the Morning. Knighthood simply gave them a new vocabulary to express what they had always believed, a new framework within which to continue their ancient tradition. The Swords of the Morning became knights, took the vows of knighthood before the Seven, swore to defend the faith and protect the innocent. But they were also something more than ordinary knights. Something older, something that predated the Andals and their religion. They carried a blade that had fallen from the stars in the dawn of the world. They embodied traditions that stretched back into the Age of Heroes. They were knights, yes, but they were also the inheritors of something far more ancient, a tradition that connected them to the very beginnings of their house, to the moment when the fallen star was first found and forged into dawn. This dual identity, this combination of ancient First Men heritage and Andal knightly tradition, became characteristic of House Dayne. They were simultaneously one of the oldest houses in Westeros, and one that had successfully adapted to the Andal conquest, simultaneously guardians of an ancient mystery and fully integrated members of the new chivalric culture that the Andals had brought. This ability to hold contradictions in balance, to be both conservative and adaptive, both traditional and innovative, was perhaps what allowed them to survive when so many other ancient houses fell. The political landscape of Dorne during this period was complex and constantly shifting. The Andal conquest did not result in a single unified kingdom as it had in other regions. Instead, Dorne remained fractured, divided among numerous petty kingdoms and lordships, some ruled by Andal invaders, some by First Men houses that had survived and adapted, some by a mixture of both. House Dayne would have had to navigate this complex political environment, forming alliances, defending their borders, participating in the endless small wars and feuds that characterised Dornish politics. One of the most significant relationships for House Dayne during this period and in the centuries that followed was with House Martell. The Martells were themselves relative newcomers, an Andal house that had established itself in southeastern Dorne, ruling from Sunspear and gradually extending their influence over the surrounding territories. The relationship between Dayne and Martell was sometimes friendly, sometimes tense, always important. The Danes of Starfall and the Martells of Sunspear were the two most powerful houses in Dorne through much of the post-Andal period, and how they related to each other often determined the course of Dornish politics. House Dayne maintained their independence during this time, ruling their lands from Starfall, serving no overlord, answering to no king. They were their own masters, as they had been since the Age of Heroes. This independence was precious to them, was part of their identity as an ancient house that had endured across the ages. They would fight to preserve it, would make alliances when necessary and stand alone when they had to, would do whatever was required to ensure that House Dayne remained free and that Dorne remained at Starfall. The lands they ruled were not the richest in Westeros, Dorne's harsh climate saw to that, but they were strategically valuable and capable of supporting a substantial population. The Torrentine River Valley was fertile, the coastal areas provided access to sea trade, the mountains held mineral wealth. House Dayne could maintain a strong military force, could build and maintain their castle, could live in comfort if not in opulence. They were not as wealthy as the Lannisters or the Hightowers, but they were far from poor, and their ancient lineage and the prestige of Dorne gave them status that went beyond mere wealth. The common people who lived on Dayne lands during this period, the farmers and fishermen, the craftsmen and traders, would have experienced the Andal conquest and its aftermath in their own ways. For them, the change of religion might have been more gradual, the old gods persisting in folk practice even as the new gods were officially adopted. They would have paid their taxes and provided their labour to House Dayne as they had always done, would have looked to Starfall for protection and justice, would have taken pride in belonging to one of the oldest and most honoured houses in Dorne. The Sword of the Morning would have been a figure of legend to them, a protector and champion whose very existence made their lives safer and gave them something to believe in beyond the daily struggle for survival. The faith of the Seven, as it established itself in Dorne, found in House Dayne both a supporter and something of a puzzle. The Danes were pious. They built septs and supported the faith. They raised their children in the seven-pointed star. But they also maintained their ancient tradition of the Sword of the Morning. They kept Dorne as a sacred relic, even though it predated the faith by thousands of years. They embodied a kind of honour and nobility that seemed to come from something older than the teachings of the Seven. The Septons and Septors who served on Dane lands must have wondered sometimes whether this ancient house had truly converted, or whether they had simply found a way to make the new religion compatible with their much older identity. The truth, as is often the case, was probably somewhere in between. The Danes genuinely believed in the Seven, or at least their descendants would come to genuinely believe, the conversion becoming more real with each generation that was raised in the faith. But they also remained connected to their ancient past in ways that other houses that had converted were not. They maintained traditions and symbols that predated the Andals. They embodied a continuity that stretched back beyond the reach of memory. They were both fully faithful members of the Seven and inheritors of something far older, and they saw no contradiction in this, saw it rather as two aspects of the same identity. As the centuries passed, as the Andal conquest became ancient history in its own right, as the cultural fusion of First Men and Andals created what we now think of as Westerosi culture, House Dayne endured. They weathered changes in Dornish politics, the rise and fall of other houses, periods of prosperity and periods of hardship. Through it all, Dorne remained at Starfall, sometimes carried by a Sword of the Morning, whose deeds would be remembered for generations, sometimes resting in the castle, waiting for a worthy wielder to emerge, but always there, always the symbol of the house, always connecting the present to that distant moment in the Age of Heroes when a star fell from the sky. The house that emerged from this long period of transition and adaptation was in some ways very different from the First Men kingdom that had existed before the Andals came, but in other ways it was fundamentally the same. The names of the lords might have changed, incorporating Andal naming conventions alongside First Men traditions. The religion they professed was different, the seven-pointed star replacing the weirwood face. The armour they wore and the castles they built reflected Andal innovations, but the core identity remained, the connection to the fallen star, the tradition of the Sword of the Morning, the pride in being one of the oldest continuously ruling houses in all of Westeros. This ability to change while remaining the same, to adapt while preserving essential identity, was perhaps House Dayne's greatest strength. It was what allowed them to survive the Andal invasion, when so many other First Men houses were destroyed or displaced. It was what would allow them to survive the many other challenges that would come in the thousands of years between the Andal conquest and the present day. It was wisdom hard won. The understanding that survival sometimes requires flexibility, that holding too tightly to tradition can lead to destruction, but that abandoning tradition entirely means losing what makes you who you are. And so House Dayne found the balance, walked the line between preservation and adaptation, between honouring the past and embracing the future. They became a house that could trace its lineage back 8,000 years, while also being fully part of the world as it currently existed. A house that kept a sword forged from a fallen star while also participating in tournaments and serving in royal courts. A house that was simultaneously ancient and contemporary, rooted in the past and alive in the present. This synthesis, this successful navigation of the tension between tradition and change, was an achievement as impressive in its own way as any victory in battle or any heroic deed performed by a Sword of the Morning. It was the achievement of survival, of continuity, of maintaining identity across the vast gulf of ages, and it would serve House Dayne well in all the centuries that were yet to come. The long centuries after the Andal invasion brought relative stability to Dorne and to House Dayne, but stability in Westeros, we must remember, is always temporary, always vulnerable to disruption by ambitious men with the power to reshape the world. And in the year that would later be marked as one before the conquest, the world was about to be reshaped in ways that no one in the Seven Kingdoms could have anticipated. Across the narrow sea, on the island of Dragonstone, a Valyrian lord named Aegon Targaryen was making preparations for a campaign that would unite 6 of the 7 kingdoms under his rule, a campaign that would bring dragonfire to Westeros for the first time, a campaign that would change everything except, as it would turn out, Dorne. The Targaryens were the last of the Dragon Lords, the sole survivors of the doom of Valyria that had occurred more than a century before, and they possessed 3 dragons, magnificent creatures of legend made flesh, capable of laying waste to armies and melting the strongest castles. Aegon and his sister wives Visenya and Rhaenys would use these dragons to conquer the kingdoms of Westeros one by one, overwhelming opposition through a combination of military might and strategic brilliance. Offering peace to those who bent the knee and fire and blood to those who resisted. Within 2 years, the Stormlands, the Riverlands, the Reach, the Westerlands, the Vale, and the North had all submitted to Targaryen rule. But Dorne, as it had done with the Undals before, and as it would do with every attempt at conquest throughout its long history, proved exceptional. The Dornish would resist the dragons as they had resisted every invader, and they would succeed where all others had failed, maintaining their independence for more than a century and a half after Aegon's initial conquest. House Dayne, ancient and proud, would play their part in this resistance, would participate in the long, brutal conflict that would define Dornish identity for generations to come. The initial Targaryen conquest of the 6 kingdoms was swift and devastating. At the Field of Fire, the combined armies of the Reach and the Rock, numbering perhaps 60,000 men, were incinerated by dragonfire, the greatest army ever assembled in Westeros reduced to ash in a single afternoon. At Harrenhal, the strongest castle in the 7 kingdoms melted like wax under the flames of Balerion the Black Dread. The message was clear and terrible. There was no defence against dragons, no army large enough, no castle strong enough, no amount of courage or skill that could stand against fire from the sky. But the Dornish, watching from their desert kingdom, drew different lessons from these catastrophes. They saw that the Targaryens won through set-piece battles, through destroying armies in the field and forcing kings to their knees. They saw that the dragons, for all their terrible power, could only be in one place at a time, could only burn what they could see and reach. They saw that occupation required more than just military victory, required controlling territory and governing people who did not wish to be governed. And they began to plan a different kind of war, a war that would frustrate the dragons and deny the Targaryens the victory they sought. When Aegon's demands for submission reached Sunspear, Princess Meria Martell, who ruled Dorne at that time, sent back a reply that would become legendary. She was an old woman by then, nearly blind and 80 years of age, but her spirit was unbroken. She told Aegon's messenger that he might be able to burn her, but he could not burn Dorne itself. It was a profound insight, a recognition that the Targaryens' strength was also their limitation, that dragons could destroy but could not hold, could kill but could not govern. House Dayne, ruling from Starfall in Western Dorne, received the same demand for submission that all the lords of Westeros received. They would have gathered in council, the Lord of Starfall and his advisors, perhaps including the Sword of the Morning if one was active at that time. And they would have discussed what response to make. They could have bent the knee as so many others had done, could have saved their castle and their people from dragonfire, could have accepted Targaryen overlordship and retained their lands and titles. No one would have faulted them for making this choice, not after seeing what happened to those who resisted. But House Dayne had not survived for 8,000 years by abandoning Dorne in its time of need. They were Dornish. However ancient their lineage, however much they might differ from other Dornish houses in their customs and their history. When Dorne called for resistance, when Princess Meria declared that the Dornish would fight rather than submit, House Dayne answered that call. They would stand with Sunspear, would commit their strength to the defence of Dornish independence, would risk everything rather than bend the knee to a foreign conqueror, even one who commanded dragons. The war that followed was unlike anything Westeros had seen before or would see again. The Targaryens invaded Dorne multiple times over the course of more than a decade, and each time they met the same frustrating pattern. The Dornish would not fight set-piece battles where dragons could destroy them. Instead, they employed guerrilla warfare, ambush and retreat, scorched earth tactics that denied the invaders supplies and shelter. When the Targaryens and their armies advanced, the Dornish would melt away into the deserts and the mountains, abandoning their castles and their villages, taking their people and their supplies with them. House Dayne participated fully in this strategy. When Targaryen forces approached Starfall, whether by land or by sea, the Danes would evacuate, taking their people and their treasures, including Dorne, into the hinterlands. The castle might be occupied, but it would be empty, offering nothing to the occupiers but stone walls and empty rooms. And when the Targaryens moved on, as they always had to do, the Danes would return and reclaim what was theirs. It was frustrating for everyone involved, costly and exhausting, but it worked. The Targaryens could not hold what they could not defend, and they could not defend everything simultaneously. The Dornish also employed tactics that the more chivalrous kingdoms would have considered dishonourable. They poisoned wells, they attacked supply trains, they used assassins against Targaryen commanders, they struck at night and disappeared before retaliation could be organised. House Dayne, for all their tradition of knightly honour, participated in these tactics as well. They understood that this was a war for survival, that honour in the traditional sense was a luxury they could not afford, that sometimes preserving your people and your independence required setting aside peacetime scruples and doing what was necessary. The Torrentine River Valley, which House Dayne controlled, became a frequent battleground. The river provided a route into the interior of Dorne, a source of water in the Desert Kingdom. A strategic asset that the Targaryens wanted to control, House Dayne defended this territory as they had defended it for thousands of years, using their knowledge of the land, their familiarity with the terrain, their understanding of how to fight in the Dornish heat. They harassed Targaryen forces, cut off supply lines, made the occupation as costly and difficult as possible. The turning point in the war, the event that would harden Targaryen determination and intensify the conflict, came in the year 10 after the conquest. Queen Rhaenys, Aegon's younger sister-wife, was killed in Dorne along with her dragon Meraxes. The exact circumstances remain disputed, lost in the fog of war and conflicting accounts. But the most common version says that a lucky shot from a scorpion, one of the massive crossbows the Dornish had developed specifically to kill dragons, struck Meraxes in the eye. The dragon fell from the sky and crashed in the desert, killing Rhaenys in the fall or perhaps in the subsequent attack by Dornish forces. This was an enormous blow to the Targaryens, both personally and strategically. Rhaenys had been beloved, gentle and beautiful, the joy in Aegon's life. Her death transformed Aegon, made him harder and more ruthless, filled him with a desire for vengeance that would drive him to commit atrocities he might otherwise have avoided. Strategically, the loss of Meraxes reduced the Targaryen dragon force by a third, proving that dragons were not invincible, that they could be killed if the right tactics were employed. House Dayne was not directly responsible for Rhaenys' death. The credit or blame for that belongs to other Dornish houses, but they certainly celebrated it as all of Dorne did. It was proof that resistance was not futile, that the seemingly invincible Targaryens could be hurt, that dragons could fall from the sky just like the star that had become Dawn thousands of years before. The news would have spread quickly through the Dane lands, would have been met with relief and grim satisfaction, would have strengthened the resolve to continue the fight no matter the cost. Aegon's response to his wife's death was delayed but terrible. 2 years later, in the year 12 after the conquest, he flew to Dorne alone on Balerion and burned. He did not attempt conquest this time, did not try to force submission or occupy territory. He simply burned. Castle after castle, town after town, his grief and rage expressed in dragon fire that turned stone to slag and sand to glass. Every Dornish castle that had refused to bend the knee was targeted, and the devastation was immense. Starfall was among the targets of this vengeance. Aegon came to the Torrentine on Balerion, and he burned. The accounts from this period are fragmentary and contradictory, but it seems clear that substantial damage was done to the castle and the surrounding lands. How much of Starfall survived this attack is unclear, whether the current structure is the original castle rebuilt, or whether it had to be substantially reconstructed afterwards. What is certain is that the Danes, like all of Dorne, paid a terrible price for their resistance. But even this devastating attack did not break Dornish resolve. The Dornish, including House Dayne, simply retreated further into the desert, waited for Aegon to leave as he eventually had to do, and then returned to rebuild. They buried their dead, they reconstructed what had been destroyed, they tended to the burned and the wounded, and they prepared to continue the fight. Aegon had taken his vengeance, had killed thousands, had destroyed castles that had stood for centuries, but he had not conquered Dorne. He had not forced submission. He had not achieved his goal. The war continued in a desultory fashion for years after this, with occasional raids and skirmishes but no major campaigns. The Targaryens had other concerns, governing the 6 kingdoms they had conquered, dealing with internal rebellions, building their capital at King's Landing. Dorne remained independent, battered and burned but unsubdued, a constant reminder that even dragons had their limits. House Dayne emerged from this period scarred but intact, their castle damaged but still standing, their people reduced but not broken. Dorne safe and ready to be wielded again when a worthy bearer emerged. The long Dornish resistance to the Targaryens, which would continue for more than a century and a half after Aegon's initial conquest, became a defining element of Dornish identity. The Dornish were the unbowed, the unbent, the unbroken, the only kingdom that had successfully resisted the dragons. This pride, this sense of being special because they alone had maintained their independence, would shape Dornish culture and politics for generations. House Dayne, as participants in this resistance, shared in this pride, added their own chapter to the long story of Dornish defiance. But the cost had been terrible. Thousands had died, castles had been burned, whole villages had been destroyed. The population of Dorne had been significantly reduced. The economic damage was immense. The trauma of living under the constant threat of dragonfire would affect generations. House Dayne had lost people they loved, had seen their lands burned, had endured horrors that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. Resistance had preserved independence, but it had come at a price that was almost unbearable. We should pause here to consider what this meant for the common people who lived on Dane lands during this terrible time. They had no choice about whether to resist or submit, no voice in the councils that decided Dorne's strategy. They simply had to endure, had to flee when the dragons came, had to hide in the desert or the mountains, had to watch their homes burn and their fields destroyed, had to bury their children and their parents and somehow find the will to continue. For them, the war was not about pride or independence or maintaining political autonomy. It was about survival, about getting through each day. It was about protecting their families as best they could in circumstances that offered precious little protection. The guerrilla warfare that the Dornish employed, while strategically effective, was brutal for the civilian population. Scorched earth tactics meant destroying your own villages to deny them to the enemy, poisoning your own wells, burning your own crops. The common people bore the brunt of these tactics, were the ones who lost everything so that the strategy could work. They did this willingly, or at least without open rebellion, because they understood what submission to the Targaryens would mean, because they valued their Dornish independence, because they trusted their lords to eventually lead them to victory or at least to survival. House Dayne, for their part, would have tried to protect their people as much as possible, would have provided for them in the wilderness, would have shared their own resources, would have done everything in their power to minimize the suffering. But there was only so much they could do. The war was larger than any one house. The strategy was set by Princess Meria in Sunspear, and the Danes, like all Dornish lords, had to follow that strategy or break the united front that was the only thing keeping Dorne independent. The eventual resolution of the Dornish question would not come through military conquest but through diplomacy and marriage alliance. But that was far in the future, more than a century and a half away. For now, for the period we're discussing, the Dornish resistance had succeeded in its immediate goal, maintaining independence, proving that dragons could be resisted, that the Targaryens did not and could not rule all of Westeros. It was a victory, though one purchased at such cost that celebration was muted, mixed with grief for all that had been lost. House Dayne's participation in this resistance added another chapter to their long history, another set of stories that would be told around fires and in the halls of Starfall for generations to come. They had stood with Dorne, had endured dragonfire, had lost much but had not broken. The tradition of the Sword of the Morning, that ancient institution that predated the Targaryens by thousands of years, had survived the coming of the dragons just as it had survived the coming of the Andals. Dorne remained at Starfall a symbol of continuity, of endurance, of the unbroken lines stretching back to the Age of Heroes. The scars of the war, both physical and psychological, would take generations to heal. The burned castles would be rebuilt, the depopulated villages would slowly replenish themselves, the economic damage would gradually be repaired. But the memory of what had happened, the knowledge that Dorne alone had resisted the dragons, the pride in having maintained independence at such terrible cost, these would endure. They would become part of Dornish identity, would shape how the Dornish saw themselves and how others saw them, would influence Dornish politics and culture for centuries to come. For House Dayne specifically, the experience of the Targaryen wars reinforced lessons they had learned over their long history. Survival sometimes requires flexibility, requires tactical retreats, requires setting aside peacetime values to do what must be done in war. But survival also requires maintaining your core identity, preserving what makes you who you are even as circumstances force you to adapt. House Dayne had managed this balance before, had navigated the Andal invasion by adapting while preserving their essential character. They would do so again, would emerge from the Targaryen wars still recognisably themselves, still the ancient house that guarded the fallen star, still the family that produced Swords of the Morning. And as the decades passed, as the immediate trauma of the war faded into history, as new generations were born who knew the story only as something their grandparents told them, House Dayne continued as it always had. They ruled their lands from Starfall, they maintained their traditions, they waited for the next worthy wielder of Dorne to emerge. They were part of Dorne, loyal to Sunspear when loyalty was required, but also separate, unique, defined by a history that stretched back far beyond any current political arrangements. They were House Dayne, ancient and enduring, and they would remain so long after the dragons themselves had faded from the world. If you're finding these contemplative explorations of Westerosi history and politics a peaceful way to end your day, a like and subscribe really helps others discover these gentle journeys through the past. And to those already subscribed, thank you for being part of this community of those who find comfort in slowly unfolding stories of power and patience, of roses growing strong through centuries of careful cultivation. The wars with the Targaryens eventually settled into an uneasy peace, with Dorne maintaining its independence while the other 6 kingdoms bent their knees to the Iron Throne, and in this period of relative stability, we can turn our attention more fully to the institution that truly defined House Dayne across the ages, the tradition that made them unique among all the great houses of Westeros. The Sword of the Morning was not merely a title, not simply an honorific given to the Lord of Starfall or the eldest son of the ruling family. It was something far more profound, a role that carried with it expectations and responsibilities that went beyond ordinary nobility, a position that could elevate a person to legendary status or remain unfilled for generations if no one proved worthy. To understand what it meant to be Sword of the Morning, we must first understand the philosophy that underlay this tradition. Most great houses in Westeros passed their treasures and their honours down through bloodlines, from father to son, from lord to heir, following the rigid structures of inheritance that govern noble succession. Ice, the great Valyrian steel sword of House Stark, belongs to whoever rules Winterfell. Brightroar, before it was lost, belonged to the Lord of Casterly Rock. These blades are property, valuable and honoured property to be sure, but still fundamentally possessions that transfer with lordship. Dorne was different. Dorne chose its bearer, or rather, House Dayne as a collective chose who among them had earned the right to wield the blade that had fallen from the stars. This was not about inheritance or lordship, not about age or position in the line of succession. It was about worthiness, about embodying the qualities that House Dayne valued most highly, about proving through deed and character that you were fit to carry this ancient responsibility. A younger son might bear Dorne while his elder brother ruled Starfall. A daughter might prove worthy when her brothers did not. A cousin, a nephew, even a legitimized bastard. Any member of House Dayne, no matter how distant their connection to the main line, could theoretically become Sword of the Morning if they demonstrated the necessary qualities. But what exactly were these necessary qualities? What did House Dayne look for in a potential Sword of the Morning? The historical record gives us glimpses, fragments of information about various individuals who bore the title over the centuries, and from these fragments we can piece together a picture of the ideal that House Dayne pursued. First and foremost was martial skill, the ability to actually wield Dorne effectively in combat. The sword was a great sword, large and heavy despite being lighter than a normal blade of its size would be, requiring considerable strength and training to use properly. A Sword of the Morning had to be among the finest warriors of their generation, capable of standing against any knight in Westeros and having a reasonable expectation of victory. But martial skill alone was never sufficient. History is full of exceptional warriors who are nonetheless terrible people, men who used their prowess for selfish ends, who bullied the weak and served only their own interests. House Dayne demanded more from those who would bear Dorne. They required honour, that complex and sometimes contradictory quality that encompasses honesty and fair dealing. Keeping your word and upholding your vows, showing mercy when mercy is warranted and justice when justice is required. A Sword of the Morning had to be someone whose word could be trusted, whose oaths were inviolate, who would rather die than betray their principles. There was also the requirement of service, of using your abilities for purposes beyond personal glory or advancement. A Sword of the Morning was meant to be a protector, someone who defended the weak, who stood against injustice, who put the needs of others before their own comfort or safety. This ideal of service was deeply embedded in House Dayne's understanding of what the title meant. You did not wield Dorne to make yourself great. You wielded it to make the world better, to protect those who could not protect themselves, to be a light in the darkness that the blade's pale gleam symbolized. Wisdom and judgment were also valued, though these were harder to measure than martial skill. A Sword of the Morning might be called upon to make difficult decisions, to mediate disputes, to represent House Dayne in councils and negotiations. They needed to be more than just a weapon, needed to have the intelligence and discernment to know when fighting was necessary and when other solutions might be better. The greatest warriors are not always those who fight most often, but those who know when to fight and when to seek other paths. And finally, there was something ineffable, something that went beyond any specific quality we can name. a sword of the morning had to embody the spirit of House Dayne, had to connect to that ancient tradition stretching back to the Age of Heroes, had to carry themselves in a way that honoured the fallen star and all those who had borne Dawn before them. It was a matter of character, of presence, of that quality that makes some people natural leaders and exemplars even when they hold no formal authority. The process by which House Dayne determined who was worthy to bear Dawn is not fully documented, but we can infer some elements from the scattered historical accounts. There was certainly observation, watching the young members of the house as they grew and trained, noting who showed promise not just in martial arts, but in character and judgment. There would have been tests, formal or informal, opportunities to prove courage and honour, to demonstrate skill and wisdom. There would have been discussion among the elders of the house, weighing the merits of various candidates, debating who best embodied the qualities they sought. And sometimes it seems there was simply recognition, a moment when it became clear to everyone that a particular person was meant to bear Dawn. Perhaps they performed some exceptional deed, showed courage beyond what was expected, demonstrated wisdom in a difficult situation. Perhaps they had been preparing for years and simply reached the point where their worthiness was undeniable. However, the recognition came. Once House Dayne agreed that someone was worthy, Dawn would be presented to them in a ceremony that was both public celebration and solemn responsibility, a moment that marked the beginning of a new chapter in the sword's long history. But we should also acknowledge the darker side of this tradition, the burden it placed on those who aspired to worthiness. Imagine being born into House Dayne, growing up in the shadow of Dawn, knowing that your worth would be measured against an impossible standard, that you might train your entire life and still be judged unworthy to bear the blade your ancestors had carried. The pressure this created must have been immense. The disappointment of those who fell short must have been crushing. Not everyone who wanted to be Sword of the Morning could be, and the house's insistence on worthiness over inheritance meant that many talented, capable people were passed over because they lacked some quality that the tradition demanded. There were also periods, sometimes lasting decades, when no member of House Dayne was judged worthy to bear Dawn. During these times, the sword would rest in the armoury at Starfall, an honoured relic but not a living tradition, waiting for someone to emerge who could meet the standard. These were difficult periods for the house, times when they must have questioned whether the tradition could continue, whether they had set the bar too high, whether Dawn would ever be wielded again. But they held firm to their principles, refused to lower their standards just to have someone, anyone, bearing the blade. Better for Dawn to rest unused than for it to be carried by someone unworthy, someone who would diminish rather than enhance its legend. The Swords of the Morning, whose names have come down to us through history, provide glimpses into how this tradition worked in practice. There was Ulrich Dayne, who lived approximately 2,000 years before Aegon's conquest, during a period of particular instability in Dawn. Ulrich was not the Lord of Starfall, but rather a younger son, third in line for the lordship, yet he proved himself through a series of campaigns against raiders from the Stepstones, who were plaguing the Dornish coast. He led the defence of several coastal villages, personally slew the pirate captain who led the raids, and negotiated a peace that protected Dornish shipping for a generation. For these deeds and for the character he displayed in performing them, he was named Sword of the Morning at the age of 28, and he bore Dawn for the next 32 years until his death in battle against a Dornish rival house. There was Davos Dayne, called Davos the Defender, who lived approximately 1,200 years before Aegon's conquest. Davos was the Lord of Starfall, but he did not become Sword of the Morning until he was 40 years old, having spent decades proving his worthiness through just governance, military skill, and acts of personal courage. The deed that finally earned him Dawn, according to the histories, was his defence of a sept that was under attack by bandits. Davos happened to be travelling nearby when he heard of the attack, and though he was accompanied by only 3 men-at-arms, he rode immediately to the sept's defence. He fought off more than a dozen bandits, personally killing voor and routing the rest, saving the septons and scepters who had taken refuge in the building. It was not the most militarily significant action of his life, but it demonstrated the qualities House Dayne valued: courage, selflessness, protection of the innocent, willingness to risk his life for others even when the strategic importance was minimal. There was Lyanna Dayne, one of the few women known to have borne the title Sword of the Morning, who lived approximately 900 years before Aegon's conquest. Lyanna's story is particularly interesting because it challenges assumptions about gender and martial prowess in Westerosi culture. She was the daughter of the Lord of Starfall, and from a young age she showed exceptional skill with weapons, training alongside her brothers and eventually surpassing them. In a culture that generally restricted martial training to men, House Dayne's commitment to worthiness over convention allowed Lyanna to pursue her talents. She proved herself in a series of tourneys, where she competed disguised as a man, winning several melees and distinguishing herself in the lists. When her identity was revealed, there was scandal, but House Dayne stood by her, and when her father died and her brother inherited Starfall, it was Lyanna who was named Sword of the Morning. She bore Dawn for 16 years, defending Dayne lands against various threats and becoming a legend in her own time. Proof that the qualities House Dayne valued could be found in daughters as well as sons. There was Samwell Dayne, called Sam the Stargazer, who lived approximately 500 years before Aegon's conquest. Samwell's path to becoming Sword of the Morning was unusual, because he was known primarily not for his martial prowess, though he was certainly skilled, but for his wisdom and learning. He spent years studying at the Citadel in Old Town, forging several links of his Maester's chain before returning to Starfall without completing his training, because he felt his place was with his family. He brought with him knowledge of astronomy, of the movements of the stars and planets, and he became fascinated with the question of which star Dawn had fallen from, whether it was possible to trace the blade's origin by studying the heavens. He never found a definitive answer, but his research and contemplation deepened House Dayne's understanding of their own history and the cosmic significance of the fallen star. He became Sword of the Morning at 35, chosen for his combination of learning, wisdom, and martial skill, and he carried Dawn not primarily into battle but into councils and negotiations, where his intelligence and diplomatic skill served House Dayne as well as any sword stroke could have. These individual stories, and dozens more like them, illustrate the breadth of what it could mean to be Sword of the Morning. The tradition was flexible enough to accommodate different kinds of excellence, different paths to worthiness, while maintaining its core insistence on qualities that went beyond mere fighting ability. Some Swords of the Morning were primarily warriors, some were leaders and commanders, some were diplomats and peacemakers, some were scholars and philosophers. What they all shared was the recognition by their house that they embodied the ideals that gave meaning to Dawn, that they were worthy to bear a blade that had fallen from the stars. We should also consider what it meant to carry this title and this blade on a daily basis. A Sword of the Morning was constantly watched, constantly judged, held to a standard that few could meet and none could meet perfectly. Every action was scrutinized, every decision examined for wisdom and justice. If you bore Dawn, you could not afford to be petty or cruel, could not use your position for personal gain, could not fail to rise to the occasions that your role demanded. The weight of this expectation, the burden of living up to the legend, must have been exhausting. Some Swords of the Morning surely struggled with it, questioned their worthiness, wondered if they could continue to meet the demands placed upon them. There were also practical considerations. Dawn, for all its symbolic importance, was also a weapon, and weapons wear on those who use them. Fighting takes a toll on the body, leaves scars both visible and invisible, accumulates injuries that eventually slow even the most skilled warrior. Many Swords of the Morning died in battle as Ulrich Dayne did, fighting to the end rather than surrender or retreat when honour demanded they stand. Others survived their wars but retired when age or injury made them less effective, returning dawn to Starfall with mixed feelings of relief and loss, gratitude that they had been allowed to bear it, and sadness that their time was ending. The relationship between the Sword of the Morning and the Lord of Starfall could sometimes be complex, particularly when they were different people. The Lord held political authority, controlled the castle and the lands, made decisions about alliances and governance. The Sword of the Morning held the blade, embodied the house's martial honour, commanded respect that sometimes eclipsed the Lord's authority. This could lead to tension, to disagreements about strategy or priorities, to questions about who truly spoke for House Dayne in any given situation. The historical record shows instances where Lord and Sword of the Morning worked in perfect harmony, each respecting the other's role and authority, but also instances where the relationship was strained, where different visions of what was best for the house created conflict. Yet despite these tensions and difficulties, the tradition endured. Generation after generation, House Dayne maintained their insistence that dawn would only be born by those who were truly worthy, that the fallen star deserved wielders who would honour its origin and its history. This consistency across thousands of years, this refusal to compromise even when it would have been easier to simply pass dawn down like any other heirloom, speaks to a kind of institutional integrity that is rare in human affairs. House Dayne knew who they were, knew what they stood for, and they held to it across ages that saw empires rise and fall, religions come and go. Dragons appear and disappear from the world. The common people of the Dane lands, the farmers and fishermen and craftsmen who lived under the protection of Starfall, took pride in the Sword of the Morning tradition. When a new Sword of the Morning was named, it was cause for celebration throughout the territory, a sign that House Dayne continued to produce individuals of exceptional character and skill. When the current Sword of the Morning rode through the villages or appeared at local gatherings, people would come to see them, would point them out to their children, would tell stories of their deeds. The Sword of the Morning was not just a warrior or a leader, they were a symbol of what was possible, a reminder that honour and skill and service were real and valuable, that some things in this harsh world were worth aspiring to. And so the tradition continued, across the long centuries from the Age of Heroes through the coming of the Andals, through the Targaryen Wars and the periods of peace that followed, through all the changes and chances of history. Sometimes dawn was carried by a great warrior whose deeds would be remembered for generations. Sometimes it was borne by a quieter figure whose worthiness lay in wisdom and character rather than dramatic exploits. Sometimes it rested in Starfall, waiting for the next worthy soul to emerge. But always the tradition endured, the standard was maintained. The connection to that distant moment when a star fell from the sky remained unbroken. House Dayne knew what they were, and they would not compromise it for convenience or expediency, or the preferences of any particular generation. They were the keepers of the morning star, and they would remain so as long as their house endured. The long history of Swords of the Morning, stretching back thousands of years through countless worthy bearers of dawn, reached perhaps its highest expression in a man who had become synonymous with the title itself, whose legend would eclipse even the ancient traditions that produced him. Arthur Dayne was born into House Dayne sometime around the year 240 after Aegon's conquest, into a world where the Targaryen dynasty ruled from the Iron Throne, where dawn had finally been brought into the realm not through conquest but through marriage alliance, where the ancient houses like the Danes found themselves part of a unified kingdom while still maintaining their distinct identities and traditions. Arthur's childhood at Starfall would have been shaped by the dual nature of his house, ancient and noble, rooted in traditions that predated the Targaryens by thousands of years, yet also fully integrated into the chivalric culture of the Seven Kingdoms. He would have grown up hearing stories of the fallen star, of the Age of Heroes, of the long line of Swords of the Morning who had borne dawn across the ages. He would have understood from his earliest years that his house was different, special, or that they maintained standards and ideals that went beyond ordinary nobility, This understanding would have been both inspiring and burdensome, creating expectations that few could meet. From what we can piece together from various accounts, Arthur showed exceptional promise from a young age. He was not the eldest son, not the heir to Starfall, which perhaps gave him a certain freedom that heirs lack. The ability to pursue excellence without the additional weight of knowing he would one day rule. He trained in the yards at Starfall under the castle's master-at-arms, learning the sword and lance, the shield and the tactics of mounted combat. He was a natural, possessed of that combination of physical gifts and mental acuity that produces truly exceptional warriors. His hands were quick, his eyes sharp, his understanding of combat almost intuitive. But many young nobles show promise in the practice yard only to prove themselves less capable in actual battle, less able to maintain their skills when real consequences attach to failure. Arthur's testing came early. Dawn in the mid-200s after the conquest was relatively peaceful compared to earlier eras, but peace in Westeros is always imperfect, always vulnerable to disruption by outlaws and raiders, by local feuds and disputes that threaten to escalate into violence. Arthur participated in several campaigns against bandits who were plaguing the Torrentine Valley, rode with Dayne forces against raiders from the Stepstones who periodically tested Dornish coastal defences. In these actions, he distinguished himself not just through skill, but through the qualities that House Dayne valued most. He showed courage, but also restraint, willingness to fight when fighting was necessary, but also the judgment to seek peaceful solutions when they were possible. He protected the small folk who came under Dayne protection, went out of his way to ensure that the innocent were not harmed in the pursuit of the guilty. There are stories, likely embellished but perhaps containing kernels of truth, of Arthur's early deeds. One tells of him riding alone to a bandit camp to negotiate the release of captives, trusting in his own skill and the outlaw's sense of self-preservation to protect him, successfully securing the prisoner's freedom without bloodshed. Another speaks of him defending a village against a raiding party twice his number, holding a bridge single-handedly until reinforcements could arrive, his sword work so skilled that the raiders eventually withdrew rather than face him. Whether these specific events happened as described we cannot know, but they reflect the reputation Arthur was building, the sense that here was someone exceptional, someone who embodied the ideals that made a true knight. The question of when Arthur became Sword of the Morning is not definitively answered in the historical record, but it likely occurred sometime in his early 20s, after he had proven himself in these campaigns, after House Dayne had observed him long enough to be confident in his worthiness. The decision to grant him Dawn would not have been made lightly. His elders would have discussed it at length, would have considered not just his martial skill, which was clearly exceptional, but his character, his judgment, his dedication to the values that the title represented. They would have asked themselves whether this young man was ready to bear the weight of a tradition that stretched back 8,000 years, whether he had the strength not just to wield the blade, but to carry the responsibility that came with it. When the decision was made, when Dawn was presented to Arthur in whatever ceremony House Dayne used to mark such occasions, it must have been a moment of profound significance for everyone involved. Arthur was receiving not just a weapon, but a legacy, not just a title, but a calling. He was being entrusted with the honour of his house, with a blade that had fallen from the stars, with the duty to uphold standards that had been maintained across ages. For House Dayne, it was an affirmation that their traditions continued, that they could still produce individuals worthy of their ancient heritage, that the long line of Swords of the Morning would not end with this generation. Arthur's tenure as Sword of the Morning coincided with what would prove to be a crucial period in Targaryen history, and his life would become intertwined with the royal house, in ways that would ultimately lead to tragedy. He came to the attention of the court, likely through participating in tourneys where his exceptional skill could not help but be noticed. Tourneys in this period were grand affairs, bringing together knights from throughout the Seven Kingdoms, offering opportunities for young warriors to make names for themselves and for the great lords to observe and recruit talent. Arthur excelled in these competitions, not always winning, but always acquitting himself with such skill and honour that his reputation grew with each appearance. It was perhaps inevitable that someone of Arthur's abilities would be invited to join the Kingsguard, the elite brotherhood of 7 knights sworn to protect the king and the royal family, celibate and landless, giving up all claims and ties to serve the crown for the rest of their lives. For most knights, this was the highest honour imaginable, the culmination of a career, proof that they were considered among the finest warriors in the realm. For Arthur Dayne, Sword of the Morning, the decision to join the Kingsguard would have been more complex. He already bore a title and a responsibility that predated the Kingsguard by thousands of years. He already carried a blade as storied as any in Westeros. He had duties to his house, connections to his family, a role to play in Dawn. But the Kingsguard offered something as well, a chance to serve at the highest level, to test himself against the best knights from all the 7 kingdoms, to be part of history in a way that staying at Starfall, however honourable, could not provide. And perhaps there was also a sense that the values the Kingsguard represented, the oaths of service and protection, the dedication to defending the innocent and upholding justice, were fundamentally compatible with what it meant to be Sword of the Morning. Perhaps Arthur saw the Kingsguard not as a departure from his role as Dayne's champion, but as an extension of it, a way to serve on a larger stage the same ideals he would have served in Dawn. Arthur joined the Kingsguard during the reign of King Aerys II Targaryen, serving alongside other legendary knights of his era. Barristan Selmy, called Barristan the Bold, who was widely considered one of the finest knights alive, became Arthur's companion and friend within the Order. The 2 men, both dedicated to their vows, both exceptional warriors, both committed to the ideals of knighthood even as the world around them grew darker and more complicated, formed a bond that would last until Arthur's death. They trained together, served together, participated in tourneys together, and by all accounts they pushed each other to greater heights of skill and dedication. The question of what Arthur did with Dawn during his service in the Kingsguard is interesting. Kingsguard knights traditionally wielded swords of white enamel, symbolic of their purity and their vows, and they wore white armour and white cloaks. Did Arthur continue to carry Dawn, or did he leave it at Starfall during his service? The historical record is unclear on this point, with some sources suggesting he carried both swords, using Dawn in battle and the white sword for ceremonial occasions, while others suggest he left Dawn at Starfall, perhaps feeling that his Kingsguard vows superseded his role as Sword of the Morning. What seems most likely, knowing what we know of Arthur's character, is that he sought to honour both commitments, to be both Kingsguard and Sword of the Morning, to serve the crown without abandoning the responsibilities that came with bearing the blade that had fallen from the stars. Arthur's reputation within the Kingsguard and throughout the realm grew to legendary proportions. He was regarded by many, including Barristan Selmy, who was in a position to judge, as perhaps the finest knight of his generation, possibly the finest knight who had ever lived. This assessment was based not just on his skill with a blade, though that was extraordinary, but on his embodiment of the chivalric ideal. The combination of martial prowess and noble character that knights were supposed to represent but that few actually achieved. Arthur was courteous to all, gentle with the weak, terrible to the wicked, loyal to his oaths, even when loyalty became difficult, dedicated to protecting the innocent even at great personal cost. There are accounts of Arthur's prowess in tourneys during this period that border on the unbelievable. Yet they are attested to by so many sources that we must accept them as at least broadly accurate. He won countless melees and jousts, defeated knights who were themselves considered exceptional, performed feats of arms that entered immediately into legend. But what set Arthur apart from other tournament champions was the grace with which he won, the lack of arrogance or boasting, the kindness he showed to defeated opponents. He elevated those he fought against rather than diminishing them, made even those he bested feel that they had participated in something noble and worthwhile. One particular story, told by multiple sources, captures something essential about Arthur's character. During a tourney at some point in the 270s after the conquest, Arthur faced a young knight making his first appearance in a major competition. The young knight was overmatched, clearly nervous, and when Arthur easily defeated him in the joust, the younger man was devastated, humiliated before the assembled nobility. Arthur, seeing this, dismounted and walked to the fallen knight, helped him to his feet and spoke to him privately for several minutes. What he said is not recorded, but witnesses noted that the young knight left the conversation with his head held high, his honour restored, apparently grateful for the lesson rather than bitter about the defeat. This kind of thoughtfulness, this attention to the humanity of those he fought, was characteristic of Arthur throughout his life. But Arthur's service as Kingsguard was complicated by the nature of the king he served. Aerys II, who had begun his reign with promise, gradually descended into madness, becoming increasingly paranoid, cruel, and unstable. The king who should have been the embodiment of justice and wise rule became a tyrant, burning his enemies alive with wildfire, seeing plots and conspiracies everywhere, terrorizing his own court and his own family. For a knight like Arthur, sworn to protect and serve this king, sworn to obey his commands, the situation created profound moral difficulties. How do you serve honour when honour requires serving a dishonourable king? How do you uphold your vows when your vows bind you to protect and enable a madman? Arthur navigated this impossible situation as best he could, maintaining his service while perhaps trying to mitigate the worst of Aerys's cruelty, protecting innocent people when protection was possible, following orders when he had to, but finding ways to interpret those orders that allowed him to maintain some measure of his integrity. It was an impossible position, and we should not judge too harshly those who found themselves caught between conflicting duties during this terrible period. Arthur did not choose Aerys's madness, did not support the king's cruelty, but he was bound by oaths that he had taken seriously, that he believed were sacred, and breaking those oaths would have meant abandoning everything he believed about honour and duty. During this period, Arthur became particularly close to Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, Aerys's eldest son and heir to the Iron Throne. Rhaegar was in many ways Arthur's opposite in temperament, melancholic where Arthur was steady, given to dark moods and prophetic obsessions where Arthur was practical and focused on the immediate demands of duty. Yet the two men formed a deep friendship, perhaps recognising in each other a shared commitment to ideals, a shared sense that they were meant for something more than merely serving a mad king. Rhaegar was musical and contemplative, Arthur was martial and active. But they complemented each other, and Arthur became not just Rhaegar's protector, but his confidant and friend. This friendship would prove fateful, for it was Rhaegar's actions, his decision to abduct or run away with Lyanna Stark depending on which version of events one believes, that would trigger Robert's rebellion, the civil war that would destroy the Targaryen dynasty and lead directly to Arthur's death. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. For now, in this period before the rebellion, Arthur Dayne was at the height of his powers and his reputation, the Sword of the Morning and a Kingsguard knight. Perhaps the finest warrior in the Seven Kingdoms, beloved by those who knew him, admired even by those who only knew his reputation. He would return to Dorne periodically when his duties allowed, would visit Starfall and his family, would perhaps take Dorne from the armoury where it rested when he was not there, and practice with it in the yards where he had trained as a boy. These visits would have been bittersweet, reminders of the life he had left behind when he took his Kingsguard vows. Reminders of duties to his house that conflicted sometimes with his duties to the crown. But they would also have been affirmations of who he was, opportunities to reconnect with the traditions that had shaped him, to remember that he was not just a Kingsguard knight but also a Dane, also the bearer of a blade that had fallen from the stars, also part of a story that stretched back 8,000 years. The people of the Dane lands would have taken fierce pride in Arthur during this period. One of their own was serving in the Kingsguard, was considered perhaps the finest knight alive, was adding new glory to the already illustrious history of House Dayne. When Arthur visited, they would have come to see him, would have wanted to be able to say they had seen the Sword of the Morning, would have told their children and grandchildren about it for the rest of their lives. He was proof that Dawn and House Dayne could produce knights as fine as any in the Seven Kingdoms, that the ancient traditions of the Danes still mattered, still produced individuals of exceptional character and skill. But underneath all the glory and the legend, underneath the tournaments and the service and the growing reputation, there were tensions and contradictions that Arthur must have felt acutely. He served a mad king while himself being a paragon of sanity and justice. He was sworn to celibacy while perhaps longing for the family and children he had given up. He was bound to the Targaryens while his heart remained Dornish, tied to Starfall and the Torrentine, and the fallen star that defined his house. He bore Dawn but could not always carry it, was Sword of the Morning but served in a role that sometimes overshadowed that ancient title. These contradictions did not diminish Arthur, but they complicated his life, created tensions he managed through dedication to duty and focus on the immediate tasks before him, but that never fully resolved, that remained present throughout his service. And so Arthur Dayne, in the years before the rebellion, was a figure of legend but also a man caught in complicated circumstances, trying to serve multiple masters, trying to uphold contradictory commitments, trying to be true to all the different aspects of his identity, while the world around him grew darker and more troubled. He was the finest knight of his age, but he was also a man facing impossible choices, bound by oaths to a king who did not deserve his service, loyal to a friend whose actions would soon plunge the realm into war. The tragedy that awaited him was already taking shape. Though he could not have known it, could not have anticipated how the various threads of his life would come together in a tower in Dawn, at a place that would become synonymous with the end of an age, with the death of one of the greatest knights Westeros had ever known. The contradictions and tensions that had defined Arthur Dayne's service in the Kingsguard came to their tragic culmination in the year 283 after Aegon's conquest. Though the events that would lead to his death began perhaps a year earlier, when Prince Rhaegar Targaryen made a decision that would destroy his family's dynasty and plunge the Seven Kingdoms into civil war. The exact nature of what happened between Rhaegar and Lyanna Stark, the daughter of Lord Eddard Stark of Winterfell who was betrothed to Robert Baratheon, remains one of the great mysteries of this period, shrouded in conflicting accounts and partisan interpretations that make it difficult to know with certainty what actually occurred. The official story, the version told by Robert Baratheon and those who supported his rebellion, was that Rhaegar abducted Lyanna, kidnapped her against her will, dishonoured her, and held her captive while her family and betrothed desperately sought to rescue her. This version made Rhaegar a villain, a rapist and abductor, someone whose actions justified rebellion and the destruction of his entire family. But there were other whispers, other suggestions that Lyanna had gone willingly, that she and Rhaegar had been in love, that what looked like abduction was actually elopement. Two young people choosing each other despite the political complications and the promises that had already been made. The truth, as is often the case, is lost to the fog of war and the propaganda of victors, buried with those who actually knew what happened. What we do know is that Rhaegar took Lyanna to Dawn, to a place called the Tower of Joy, a small tower in the Red Mountains of Dawn, isolated and defensible, far from the centres of power where armies might march. And we know that Arthur Dayne went with him, along with two other members of the Kingsguard, Sir Gerald Hightower, the Lord Commander, and Sir Oswell Went. Three of the finest knights in the Seven Kingdoms, sworn to protect the royal family, standing guard at a remote tower while the realm tore itself apart in war. Why they were there, what they were protecting, what they knew about Rhaegar's plans and purposes, these questions have been debated for years by those who study this period. The rebellion that Rhaegar's actions triggered began when Lyanna's brother Brandon rode to King's Landing and demanded that Rhaegar come out and die. King Aerys, in his madness, arrested Brandon and his companions, then summoned their fathers to court ostensibly to answer for their sons' crimes. When the fathers came, Aerys murdered them in grotesque fashion, burning Lord Rickard Stark alive while forcing his son Brandon to watch, creating a brutality so extreme that it could not be tolerated. Jon Arryn, Lord of the Vale, was ordered to send the heads of his wards, Eddard Stark and Robert Baratheon, to King's Landing, and instead of complying, he called his banners and began the rebellion that would ultimately destroy the Targaryen dynasty. Arthur Dayne was not present for any of this. He was at the Tower of Joy with Rhaegar and Lyanna, far from the capital, removed from the terrible events that were unfolding. We might wonder what he thought during this time, whether he knew what Aerys was doing, whether he questioned Rhaegar's decision to hide in Dorne while his father committed atrocities in King's Landing. Arthur had served the Targaryens faithfully, had upheld his vows even as Aerys's madness grew worse, but surely there must have been moments at the Tower of Joy when he wondered whether he was on the right side, whether protecting Rhaegar and Lyanna while the realm burned was truly honourable, whether his duty required him to be somewhere else, doing something else. The rebellion spread quickly across the Seven Kingdoms. Robert Baratheon proved to be a formidable battlefield commander, winning a series of victories that established him as the rebellion's military leader, even though he fought primarily for personal reasons, to avenge the woman he believed had been stolen from him. Eddard Stark fought for his family's honour and to avenge his father and brother's murder. Jon Arryn fought for justice and to protect his wards. Together they assembled an army that could challenge the Targaryens, that could threaten even a dynasty that had held the Iron Throne for nearly 300 years. Rhaegar eventually left the Tower of Joy, left Arthur and the other Kingsguard behind to guard Lyanna, and rode north to take command of the Loyalist forces. He met Robert Baratheon in battle at a place called the Trident, a crossing of that great river where two armies clashed in what would prove to be the decisive engagement of the war. Rhaegar fought bravely, by all accounts fought as a prince and a warrior should, but Robert was strong and determined and filled with rage, and in the waters of the Trident Robert's warhammer crushed Rhaegar's breastplate, drove the rubies from his armour into the river, killed the prince who had triggered this war with his choice to take Lyanna Stark away from everything she had known. The news of Rhaegar's death must have reached the Tower of Joy eventually, brought by some messenger who made the long journey into the Red Mountains to inform the three Kingsguard knights that their prince was dead, that the war was lost, that Robert Baratheon was marching on King's Landing to claim the throne. We can only imagine what Arthur felt when he heard this news. Rhaegar had been his friend, perhaps the person closest to him in the world, someone he had trusted and served and believed in. Now Rhaegar was dead, his body lost in the river, the Targaryen cause collapsing, everything Arthur had served crumbling around him. King Aerys died shortly after Rhaegar, killed by Jaime Lannister, the youngest member of the Kingsguard, who broke his vows and stabbed the king in the back to prevent Aerys from burning all of King's Landing with wildfire. Jaime's decision to become a Kingslayer saved hundreds of thousands of lives, but it also destroyed his honour, marked him forever as an oathbreaker, someone who had violated the most sacred vows a knight could take. Arthur, far away at the Tower of Joy, would not have known the specific circumstances of Aerys's death, would not have known that Jaime had acted to prevent an atrocity, and the news that the king had been killed by one of his own Kingsguard must have been devastating, a betrayal that called into question everything the Order stood for. With both Rhaegar and Aerys dead, with King's Landing fallen to Robert's forces, the Targaryen cause was effectively finished. Rhaegar's wife and children were dead, murdered by Gregor Clegane in an atrocity that Robert Baratheon accepted if he did not order. The pregnant Queen Rhaella and her young son Viserys fled to Dragonstone, where Rhaella would die giving birth to a daughter Daenerys, before Viserys took his infant sister and fled across the narrow sea into exile. The dynasty that had ruled for nearly 300 years, that had united the Seven Kingdoms with fire and blood, was scattered and broken, reduced to 2 children in exile, and whatever remnants of loyalty still existed among those who had served them. But at the Tower of Joy, Arthur Dayne and his 2 companions remained. They had been ordered to stay and guard Lyanna, and orders from a prince of the blood, even a dead prince, still carried weight for men who took their oaths as seriously as these 3 did. Or perhaps there was something else keeping them there, something they knew that we do not, some reason beyond mere duty that made them believe their place was at this remote tower rather than somewhere else, trying to salvage what remained of the Targaryen cause or fleeing into exile with the surviving members of the royal family. Eddard Stark, having helped win the war, having avenged his father and brother, came to the Tower of Joy seeking his sister. He brought with him 6 companions, men he trusted, northern warriors who had fought through the rebellion at his side. The accounts of what happened when Ned Stark and his 6 men confronted Arthur Dayne and the 2 other Kingsguard at the Tower of Joy come primarily from Ned himself, filtered through others since Ned spoke of it rarely and with obvious pain, and from Howland Reed, the only companion besides Ned who survived the encounter. The meeting began with words, as such encounters often do, a final chance for reason to prevail before steel was drawn. Ned asked Arthur and the others why they were there, why they remained at this tower when their king was dead, when the war was lost, when they could have fled to safety or sought pardons from the new king. Arthur's response has been preserved, though whether these are his exact words or merely the general sense of what he said, we cannot know with certainty. He spoke of his duty, of the vows he had taken, of promises that bound him to this place and this task. He made it clear that he would not simply step aside, would not abandon his post regardless of the political situation, that if Ned wanted to pass, he would have to fight. There was respect in this exchange, by all accounts. A recognition between the men on both sides that they were bound by honour and duty, that they were doing what they believed was right even though it brought them into conflict. Ned Stark was not cruel or bloodthirsty, did not want to kill men who were simply doing their duty. Arthur Dayne had no personal quarrel with Ned, bore no hatred for the Starks despite everything that had happened. But they were on opposite sides of an unbridgeable divide. And words could not resolve what only swords could settle. The fight that followed was brief but devastating. 7 against 3 should have been a foregone conclusion, but these were not ordinary fighters. Arthur Dayne was perhaps the finest swordsman alive. Gerald Hightower was the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, chosen for that position because of his skill and experience. Oswell Went was formidable in his own right. They fought in a defensive position at the tower's entrance, preventing Ned and his companions from using their numbers to full advantage, wielding their blades with skill born of decades of training and combat. The accounts vary on the details, on who fell first and how the battle unfolded, but they agree on the outcome. 5 of Ned's 7 companions died in the fight. Gerald Hightower was killed, Oswell Went was killed, and finally Arthur Dayne fell, brought down in circumstances that remain somewhat unclear. Howland Reed, who was there and survived, apparently played a crucial role in Arthur's death, though the exact nature of his contribution is disputed. Some sources suggest he attacked Arthur from behind, others that he used some tactic or technique that allowed Ned to land the killing blow, still others that he intervened at a moment when Arthur would have otherwise prevailed. What we can say with confidence is that Arthur Dayne died at the Tower of Joy, died fighting for a cause that was already lost, defending a prince who was already dead, maintaining his vows and his duty even when both had become meaningless in any practical sense. He died as he had lived, as a knight devoted to honour and service, unable or unwilling to compromise his principles even when compromise might have saved his life. Whether this makes him admirable or tragic or some combination of both is a question each person must answer for themselves. Ned Stark, by all accounts, wept when Arthur died. He had been forced to kill a man he respected, had lost 5 friends in the process, and the whole encounter had the character of waste and tragedy rather than victory. Ned took Arthur's sword, Dawn, with the intention of returning it to Starfall, of giving House Dayne back the blade that had fallen from the stars. This gesture, taking the sword of a fallen enemy to return it to his family, rather than keeping it as a trophy, speaks to Ned's character and to the respect Arthur commanded even from those who fought against him. Inside the tower, Ned found his sister Lyanna, dying from complications of childbirth, having given birth to a son whose parentage would be kept secret, whose very existence would be denied to protect him from Robert Baratheon's hatred of anything Targaryen. What Lyanna said to Ned in those final moments, what promises she extracted from him, what she told him about Rhaegar and their relationship and the child she had borne, all of this remained shrouded in mystery. Known only to Ned and taken to his grave when he was executed years later by another mad king. The deaths at the Tower of Joy marked the effective end of the Targaryen dynasty's rule over Westeros, and the end of an age of great knights. Arthur Dayne was gone, Barristan Selmy had been defeated in battle and pardoned by Robert, Jaime Lannister was a Kingslayer whose honour was forever tainted. The institution of the Kingsguard would continue, would be filled with new members serving the new king, but it would never again have the same legendary character it had possessed when Arthur Dayne and his contemporaries served. For House Dayne, Arthur's death was a terrible loss, the end of perhaps the greatest Sword of the Morning in their long history. The house that had produced him could take pride in his deeds, in the honour he had shown even in death, in the respect his enemies gave him. But pride does not fill the absence left by death, does not restore what has been lost, does not make the grief any less sharp. Arthur had been the embodiment of everything House Dayne valued, had carried their ancient blade and their ancient traditions into the wider world, and had proven them worthy of honour even among those who did not share their history or their bloodline. The Tower of Joy became a name of sadness rather than happiness, a place associated with death and tragedy, rather than whatever joy Rhaegar and Lyanna might have found there in their brief time together. It stood as a monument to loyalty carried to the point of self-destruction, to duty maintained even when duty had become divorced from any larger purpose, to the complications and contradictions inherent in the concept of honour, when honour requires serving causes and people who may not deserve service. Ned Stark kept his promise. He brought Dawn back to Starfall, returned it to House Dayne, even though they had fought on opposite sides of the war, even though Arthur had helped guard the woman Ned had come to save. This act of honour and respect, this recognition that some obligations transcend politics and warfare, created a bond between House Stark and House Dayne that would persist even through the changes and upheavals that followed. House Dayne would name Ned a friend despite everything that had happened, would recognise that he had acted with honour even in the terrible circumstances of the rebellion and its aftermath. Dawn returned to the armoury at Starfall, no longer carried by the man who had wielded it so brilliantly, waiting once again for someone worthy to emerge from House Dayne who could take up the burden of being Sword of the Morning. The blade that had fallen from the stars had outlived another of its bearers, had returned home as it always did, patient and eternal while the humans who wielded it lived and died in their brief spans. Arthur Dayne passed into legend, his deeds and his character discussed and debated, his final stand at the Tower of Joy becoming part of the lore of the realm. A story told in different ways with different emphases depending on who was telling it and what lessons they wished to draw. And in the Red Mountains of Dawn, a tower stood silent, marked by the deaths of men who had been too honourable to simply walk away, too committed to their duties to seek the survival that pragmatism might have offered. The Tower of Joy, misnamed now if it ever had been properly named, remained as a memorial to the costs of honour, to the tragedies that occur when good men find themselves on opposite sides of unbridgeable divides, to the particular sadness of Arthur Dayne's death far from his home, far from the Torrentine and Starfall and the lands he'd been born to protect, dying for a prince and a cause that were already lost, maintaining his vows to the very end. The years following Arthur Dayne's death at the Tower of Joy were difficult ones for House Dayne, a period of mourning and adjustment, of coming to terms with the loss of perhaps their greatest representative in living memory, and of finding their place in a realm that had been fundamentally transformed by Robert's rebellion. The Baratheon dynasty now sat on the Iron Throne, the Targaryens were in exile or dead, and the political landscape of Westeros had been redrawn in ways that required all the great houses, including the ancient House Dayne, to reconsider their positions and their futures. House Dayne had not participated directly in Robert's rebellion on either side, being in Dorne and focused on their own affairs while the war raged in the other kingdoms. But Arthur's presence at the Tower of Joy had created a complicated legacy. On one hand, he had died serving the Targaryens, fighting against Ned Stark, who was now one of the most powerful lords in the new regime, Hand of the King and Warden of the North. This could have created difficulties for House Dayne, could have marked them as Targaryen loyalists in a kingdom now ruled by those who had overthrown that dynasty. On the other hand, Ned Stark's respect for Arthur, his decision to return Dorne to Starfall, his evident grief at having been forced to kill a man he admired, all of this created a strange bond between the houses, a recognition that honour could exist on both sides of a conflict, that enmity in war did not have to translate into lasting hatred in peace. The Lord of Starfall during this period, Arthur's elder brother or perhaps his cousin, depending on the exact family structure, which is not clearly documented in the surviving records, faced the task of navigating this complicated situation. House Dayne needed to demonstrate loyalty to the new regime, while also honouring Arthur's memory and maintaining their proud independence. They needed to rebuild their position in Dorne, to ensure their interests were protected in the new political order, to continue the traditions that had sustained them for 8,000 years, even as the world around them changed once again. Dorne returned to the armoury at Starfall, resting in whatever place of honour House Dayne maintained for their most precious possession, waiting for the next Sword of the Morning to emerge. But there would not be another Sword of the Morning for many years after Arthur's death. Perhaps because the loss was too fresh, the standard he had set too high, the younger members of the house not yet ready to claim a title so recently borne by someone of his calibre. Or perhaps there simply was no one in that generation who met the exacting standards House Dayne maintained, no one who combined the necessary martial skill with the character and wisdom that the role demanded. Dorne could wait, had waited before, would wait as long as necessary until someone worthy emerged. The absence of a Sword of the Morning during this period, the empty place at the heart of House Dayne's identity, must have been felt acutely by everyone at Starfall. The title was not merely decorative, not just a name that could be set aside without consequence. It was central to how House Dayne understood themselves, to their place in the world, to their connection to the ancient past and to the star that had fallen from the sky. To not have a Sword of the Morning was to feel incomplete, to sense that something essential was missing, even as the daily business of ruling and managing the house's affairs continued. But House Dayne endured this absence as they had endured everything else across their long history, maintaining their standards, refusing to compromise just to fill a vacancy, trusting that in time someone would prove themselves worthy and the tradition would continue. This patience, this willingness to wait for excellence rather than settling for adequacy, was characteristic of the house's long-term perspective, their understanding that what mattered was not the immediate situation, but the continuity of traditions across generations and centuries. There was also the question of Arthur's sister, Ser Arthur Dayne, whose story is intertwined with Arthur's in ways that remain unclear and contested. Ser had been a lady-in-waiting to Princess Elia Martell, had been at court in King's Landing during the early part of the Robert's Rebellion, and was said to be extraordinarily beautiful, one of the great beauties of her generation. There are suggestions, hints in the various sources, that she had been in love with someone, that she bore a child whose father's identity remains uncertain, that she was distraught by Arthur's death and by other losses during the rebellion. What is certain is that Ser Dayne died. Throwing herself from one of the towers at Starfall into the sea below, some time after Arthur's death and after the return of dawn to the castle. The exact timing and the reasons for her suicide are lost to speculation and rumour, buried under years of gossip and conflicting accounts. Some say she killed herself from grief over Arthur's death, others that she was mourning a lost love, still others that she was driven to despair by the death of a child, or by dishonour real or imagined. The truth, as with so many things about this period, remains elusive. House Dayne lost two of its most prominent members in quick succession. Arthur to violence at the Tower of Joy and Ashara to whatever despair drove her to end her own life. These losses must have shaken the house to its foundations, must have created a sense of grief and crisis that affected everyone at Starfall and throughout the Dane lands. The people who had been so proud of Arthur, who had celebrated his achievements and taken comfort in his protection, now mourned his death and tried to make sense of why such a noble knight had died in such tragic circumstances, fighting for a lost cause at a remote tower far from home. Yet life continued, as it always does, as it must. The fields along the Torrentine still needed to be planted and harvested, the castle still needed to be maintained, disputes still needed to be resolved, children still needed to be raised and trained. House Dayne continued to rule their lands, to participate in Dornish politics, to maintain their position as one of the ancient and honoured houses of the Seven Kingdoms, even as they dealt with their grief and their losses. In the years following the rebellion, a new generation began to come of age at Starfall, children who'd been too young to remember Arthur or who had been born after his death, for whom the legend of the Great Sword of the Morning was something they heard in stories rather than something they had witnessed themselves. Among these younger Danes was a boy who would eventually become the next Lord of Starfall, a child named Edric but called Ned, a name that would connect him to Eddard Stark and to the complicated history between their houses. Edric Dayne was born sometime around the year 287 or 288, after Aegon's conquest. Several years after Arthur's death, into a house still mourning its losses but also looking toward the future. The exact details of his parentage are somewhat unclear in the historical record, but he was of the main Dane line, positioned to eventually inherit Starfall and the lordship of the house. He grew up surrounded by the legacy of Arthur, hearing stories of his famous relative, training in the same yards where Arthur had trained, learning the same values of honour and service that had shaped Arthur's life. There was a particular connection between young Edric and House Stark, a bond that went beyond the general respect that had developed between the houses after Arthur's death. According to some accounts, Edric was sent to be fostered at another house, as noble children often were, being raised and trained away from their birth home to create alliances and broaden their education. The house where Edric fostered, interestingly, had connections to the Starks, creating personal ties between the young Dane heir and the family whose patriarch had killed Arthur at the Tower of Joy. This fostering arrangement, if it occurred as the sources suggest, speaks volumes about how House Dayne chose to respond to the complicated legacy of Arthur's death. Rather than nursing resentment against the Starks, rather than treating them as enemies who had killed their greatest knight, House Dayne embraced the connection, sent their heir to be educated in an environment connected to the Starks, built bridges instead of walls. This was wisdom of a kind that is rare in human affairs, the ability to recognise that Arthur himself had respected Ned Stark, that the tragedy at the Tower of Joy was not a simple matter of good versus evil, but rather a collision of honourable men serving different causes. Edric Dayne grew up, by all accounts, to be a youth of promise, skilled in arms and educated in the ways of nobility, bearing the Dane name with honour even if he would not, at least not yet, bear Dorne itself. He was described as having the characteristic Dane features, the pale hair and the purple eyes that marked their ancient Valyrian or perhaps First Men ancestry. carrying himself with a dignity that suited his position as heir to one of the oldest houses in Westeros. He learned the history of his house, understood the significance of dawn and the tradition of the Sword of the Morning, internalized the values that had sustained House Dayne across 8 millennia. The absence of a current Sword of the Morning during Edric's youth meant that he and others of his generation had no living example to model themselves on, no contemporary bearer of dawn whose deeds they could witness and whose example they could follow. This might have made the tradition seem more distant, more abstract, something historical rather than immediate. But it also meant that Arthur's legend remained undimmed, uncompromised by comparison to a lesser successor, allowed to grow in the telling until he became almost mythical, the standard against which all future Swords of the Morning would be measured. House Dayne's position in Dorne during this period was stable, if not particularly prominent. They were not the paramount house of Dorne. That position belonged to House Martell in Sunspear, but they were among the most ancient and respected of the Dornish nobility. They controlled their traditional lands along the Torrentine, maintained their seat at Starfall, participated in the councils and gatherings where Dornish policy was decided. They were loyal to Sunspear when loyalty was required. But they also maintained their independence, their sense of being separate and distinct, defined by traditions that predated Martell rule by thousands of years. The relationship between House Dayne and House Martell during this period was complex, as it had been for centuries. The Martells were the ruling house of Dorne, the princes who spoke for the kingdom and who commanded the loyalty of all Dornish houses. But House Dayne had their own ancient prestige, their own sources of authority that came not from current political power, but from their tremendous age and their unique traditions. This created a relationship of mutual respect rather than simple subordination, with House Dayne acknowledging Martell authority while also maintaining their distinct identity. Dorne itself, in the years following Robert's rebellion, was nursing its own grievances against the new regime. Princess Elia Martell, Rhaegar's wife, had been brutally murdered along with her children during the sack of King's Landing, and Robert Baratheon's acceptance of this crime without punishing those responsible had created deep resentment throughout Dorne. House Dayne shared in this resentment, as did all Dornish houses, but they also had their own particular relationship to the rebellion and its aftermath through Arthur's role and death. Dorne remained part of the Seven Kingdoms, but remained also somewhat apart, nursing old wounds, maintaining old traditions, remembering old grievances. The common people who lived on Dane lands during this period, the farmers and fishermen and craftsmen who had celebrated Arthur's achievements and mourned his death, continued their lives much as they always had. The change in dynasty from Targaryen to Baratheon meant little in their daily existence, which was governed more by the seasons and the harvest and the local administration of justice than by who sat on the Iron Throne in distant King's Landing. They paid their taxes to House Dayne, looked to Starfall for protection and governance, raised their children and buried their dead, and hoped for peace and prosperity. For them, the absence of a Sword of the Morning was perhaps less acutely felt than it was by the nobility, though they certainly noticed it, certainly spoke of it in their conversations, and wondered when someone would prove worthy to bear dawn again. The Sword of the Morning had been a source of pride and security, a symbol that their lords were special, that they lived under the protection of one of the greatest knights in the realm. Without that figure there was a sense of something missing, a vacancy at the heart of their community's identity. Dawn itself rested in the armoury at Starfall, carefully maintained, regularly inspected to ensure it remained in perfect condition, but unused, untested, waiting. The blade that had fallen from the stars had survived Arthur as it had survived all previous bearers, patient and eternal, ready to be wielded again when the right person emerged. It was both a presence and an absence. Physically present in the castle, but absent from the role it was meant to fill, a reminder of what had been lost and a promise of what might come again. House Dayne during this period was in some ways in a state of suspension, mourning the past, managing the present, waiting for the future. They maintained their traditions, upheld their honour, served Dawn, and participated in the political life of the realm. But there was a sense of incompleteness, of waiting for something to happen that would allow them to move forward fully rather than simply enduring. The generation that had known Arthur personally was aging. The generation that would only know him through stories was coming of age, and the question hung in the air. Would there be another Sword of the Morning, or had that tradition died with Arthur at the Tower of Joy? The answer, as it turned out, was that the tradition would continue, that eventually someone would prove themselves worthy, that Dawn would be wielded again. But that was still in the future, still uncertain during the years we are discussing. For now, House Dayne endured their losses, raised their children, maintained their lands, and waited with the patience of a house that had survived for 8,000 years and intended to survive for 8,000 more. They were House Dayne, ancient and enduring, keepers of the fallen star, guardians of traditions that stretched back to the Age of Heroes, and they would continue to be these things regardless of who ruled in King's Landing or what tragedies befell individual members of their family. The star might fall silent for a time, but it would shine again, because that was the nature of House Dayne, to endure, to persist, to maintain their identity across ages that would humble lesser houses into dust and forgetting. As we move from the specific history of House Dayne and the individuals who bore their ancient sword toward a more contemplative examination of what all of this means, we might pause to consider Dawn itself not merely as a weapon, or even as a symbol, but as something more complex and mysterious, something that sits at the intersection of legend and reality, of the material and the mythic. For 8,000 years this blade has existed, has been passed from hand to hand, has witnessed the rise and fall of kingdoms and religions and dynasties, and throughout all of this time it has remained fundamentally unchanged, fundamentally itself, a pale blade forged from a fallen star, waiting patiently for those worthy to wield it. What is Dawn, really? At the most basic level, it is a sword, a tool designed for a specific purpose, for cutting and thrusting, for attack and defense, for the taking of human life in combat. It is made of metal, has weight and balance, can be sharpened and maintained, exists in the physical world as a tangible object that can be held and wielded and passed from person to person. In this sense, it is no different from any other sword subject to the same physical laws, capable of the same functions, limited by the same constraints of material reality. But Dawn is also more than this, has always been more than this, from the moment it was forged from the fallen star to the present day. It is a symbol of House Dayne's identity, the physical manifestation of their connection to something beyond the ordinary, their link to the stars themselves and to the Age of Heroes when the world was younger and stranger. It is the emblem of the Sword of the Morning tradition, the object that makes that role meaningful, the tangible proof that House Dayne's claims to ancient honour and exceptional standards are not merely empty boasting, but grounded in something real and enduring. The sword's origin in a fallen star, whether we accept this literally or interpret it as meaning the blade was forged from meteoritic iron, sets it apart from every other weapon in Westeros. Valyrian steel swords are precious and rare, forged through techniques lost with the doom of Valyria, capable of holding edges that ordinary steel cannot match, beautiful and deadly and valuable beyond measure. But Valyrian steel, for all its mystique, is ultimately a human creation, made by mortal hands using techniques that were learned and developed and could theoretically be learned and developed again. Dawn is different. Dawn came from beyond the world, from the heavens themselves, from a realm that humans cannot access or control or fully understand. This celestial origin imbues Dawn with a significance that transcends its practical utility as a weapon. It suggests that House Dayne's authority and identity are rooted not merely in worldly power, not merely in their ancient lineage or their lands or their political connections, but in something cosmic, something that connects earth and sky, mortal and divine, the temporal and the eternal. Whether we believe this connection is real in some metaphysical sense or merely symbolic, merely a useful fiction that gives meaning and structure to the house's traditions, the effect is the same. Dawn makes House Dayne special in a way that cannot be duplicated or stolen or purchased. Special in a way that persists across ages and remains independent of current political circumstances. The tradition that only the worthy can bear dawn. That the blade is not simply passed down through inheritance but must be earned through exceptional character and skill, adds another layer of meaning to the sword's significance. It transforms dawn from a mere possession into something like a judge, an arbiter of worthiness, a standard against which individuals must measure themselves. This is a profound philosophical move, a way of institutionalizing humility and excellence within the structure of noble inheritance, which normally rewards birth over merit, which normally gives power and privilege to eldest sons regardless of their actual capabilities or character. By insisting that dawn must be earned, that no amount of noble blood or inherited title can substitute for actual worthiness, House Dayne created a check on the natural tendency of hereditary nobility to decay into mediocrity or worse. They ensured that at least some members of each generation would have to actually be excellent, would have to embody the values the house claimed to represent, or else face the shame of having no Sword of the Morning, of allowing dawn to rest unused because no one measured up to the standard. This was a heavy burden to place on their descendants, but it was also a gift, a way of preserving meaning and purpose across generations that might otherwise have lost touch with the ideals that gave the house its identity. The periods when no Sword of the Morning existed, when dawn rested in the armory waiting for someone worthy to emerge, are as significant as the periods when the blade was actively wielded. These absences testify to House Dayne's integrity, to their refusal to compromise their standards even when doing so would have been easier, more convenient, more immediately satisfying. An empty title is worse than no title at all. A blade wielded by someone unworthy diminishes rather than enhances the tradition. House Dayne understood this, accepted the pain and incompleteness that came with having no Sword of the Morning, trusted that eventually someone would prove themselves and the tradition would continue. This willingness to wait, this patience that spans decades or even generations, reflects a particular kind of wisdom, a long-term perspective that is rare in human institutions. Most organizations, most families, most traditions face pressure to compromise when circumstances become difficult, to lower standards when maintaining them becomes costly, to prioritize immediate needs over long-term integrity. House Dayne resisted these pressures, held firm to their principles across 8,000 years, survived periods of absence and loss and tragedy without abandoning what made them who they were. We might also contemplate Dawn's relationship to the broader culture of chivalry and knighthood in Westeros. The ideals that knighthood was supposed to represent, courage and honour, service and protection of the weak, justice tempered with mercy, these ideals were rarely achieved in practice. Most knights were simply warriors, men trained to fight who used their skills for whatever purposes their lords demanded or their own self-interest suggested. The gap between the ideal and the reality of knighthood was vast, and everyone knew it, even as they continued to celebrate the ideal in songs and stories. But the Swords of the Morning came closer to actually embodying the chivalric ideal than almost anyone else in Westerosi history. Arthur Dayne was renowned not just for his skill, but for his character, for actually being the kind of knight that others merely pretended to be. This was not coincidence or luck, but rather the result of House Dayne's insistence on worthiness, their refusal to give the title to anyone who did not genuinely embody the qualities they valued. The Sword of the Morning was what knighthood was supposed to be, but usually was not, and this made the tradition both inspiring and somewhat troubling. A reminder of how far short most knights fell of the standards they claimed to uphold. The contrast between House Dayne's honour and Dawn's broader reputation adds another layer of complexity to our understanding of what Dawn represents. Dawn was known, particularly in the other 6 kingdoms, as a place where the normal rules did not quite apply, where succession was equal between sons and daughters, where the old blood of the Rhoynar mixed with Andal and First Men heritage created something distinct and foreign. The Dornish were seen as passionate and vengeful, exotic and dangerous, not quite civilized in the way that the Knights of the Reach or the Vale considered themselves civilized. House Dayne existed as a counterpoint to this reputation, as proof that Dorne could produce knights, and honour that matched or exceeded anything the other kingdoms offered. They were Dornish in their loyalty and their identity, but they were also somehow apart from the broader Dornish character, defined by traditions that predated Dorne itself, that went back to the Age of Heroes when the regional identities that would later develop had not yet formed. This dual identity, simultaneously Dornish and something older and separate, allowed House Dayne to serve as a bridge between Dorne and the rest of Westeros, demonstrating that honour and chivalry were not the exclusive province of any one region or culture. The question of what will become of Dorne in the future, whether there will be future Swords of the Morning who can match the legends of the past, remains open and uncertain. After Arthur's death, there was a long period when no one bore the title, when the sword waited at Starfall for someone to prove themselves worthy. Eventually perhaps someone did or will, someone whose name and deeds we might not know, because they fall outside the period covered by the sources we have access to. Or perhaps the tradition ended with Arthur. Perhaps no one after him could meet the impossible standard he set. Perhaps Dorne will rest forever unused, a memorial to greatness that can no longer be achieved. This uncertainty is itself meaningful, a reminder that traditions, no matter how ancient, no matter how carefully maintained, are always vulnerable to the passage of time and the changes it brings. Nothing is guaranteed to endure forever. Nothing is safe from the erosion of ages and the shifts in culture and values that make old traditions seem irrelevant or impossible to maintain. House Dayne has survived for 8,000 years, but there is no law of nature that says they must survive for 8,000 more. Dorne has been wielded by exceptional individuals across countless generations, but there is no guarantee that such individuals will continue to emerge. Yet the very fact that the tradition has endured so long, has survived the Andal invasion and the Targaryen conquest and Robert's rebellion and all the countless smaller crises and changes that must have occurred across 8 millennia, suggests a resilience that should not be underestimated. House Dayne has faced periods of absence before, has endured times when no Sword of the Morning existed, and the tradition has always resumed, always found new bearers worthy of the title. Perhaps this pattern will continue. Perhaps in each generation or every few generations someone will emerge who can meet the standard, who can take up Dorne and carry it forward into whatever future awaits. The sword itself, the physical object, will likely endure regardless of whether anyone worthy to wield it emerges. Properly maintained, protected from the elements, and from those who would steal or damage it, Dorne could last for thousands more years, could outlive House Dayne itself if the house were to fall, could survive the collapse of the 7 kingdoms and whatever political structures replace them. It is just metal, after all, remarkably crafted and impossibly old, but fundamentally just an arrangement of atoms that will persist, as long as they are not deliberately destroyed or allowed to corrode away. But a sword without someone to wield it, without the tradition and meaning that give it significance beyond its material existence, is just an object, a curiosity, a relic of a dead past rather than a living connection to ancient ideals. What makes Dorne matter is not the metal itself, but what it represents, the tradition it embodies, the standards it enforces, the connection it maintains to that moment 8,000 years ago, when a star fell from the sky and changed the destiny of one family forever. Without the tradition, without the Swords of the Morning and the insistence on worthiness, and the whole complex of values and practices that House Dayne has maintained across the ages, Dorne would be just another old sword, interesting perhaps but not meaningful, historical but not alive. This suggests that the true achievement of House Dayne is not the possession of Dorne, but the maintenance of the tradition surrounding it, the preservation across 8,000 years of a set of values and practices that give meaning to the blade and to the house itself. Many families possess treasured heirlooms, swords or crowns or other objects that connect them to their past. But few maintain the traditions that give those objects genuine significance. Few hold themselves to standards that make their inherited treasures more than mere possessions. House Dayne has done this, has kept alive not just the sword but the ideals it represents, has insisted that worthiness matters more than inheritance, that some things cannot be bought or stolen or claimed by right of birth, but must be earned through character and deed. The fallen star that became Dawn serves as a metaphor for House Dayne itself, for something that came from beyond the ordinary world of human affairs and transformed what it touched, creating something exceptional that has endured across ages that would reduce most human creations to dust and forgetting. The star fell, struck the earth, and in that moment of contact between celestial and terrestrial, something new was created, something that partook of both realms, that was simultaneously of this world and not of it, that connected the everyday reality of politics and warfare and human striving to something larger, more permanent, more meaningful. This metaphorical reading helps us understand why House Dayne has mattered to those who study Westerosi history and to those who hear their story. They represent the possibility that humans can create and maintain traditions that transcend the usual limitations of mortal existence, that connect us to something beyond ourselves, that give meaning and purpose across spans of time that dwarf individual lives. They prove that it is possible to hold to high standards even when circumstances make compromise tempting, that ancient traditions can remain relevant and vital even as the world changes around them, that some things are worth preserving simply because they embody ideals that humans need even if we rarely achieve them. The pale blade waiting at Starfall, whether currently wielded or resting in the armory, remains a symbol of all of this, a reminder that the stars can fall, that the impossible can become real, that worthiness is a standard worth maintaining, even when maintaining it is difficult, even when it means accepting absence and incompleteness, rather than compromising what makes you special. Dawn endures because House Dayne endures, and House Dayne endures because they have held fast to the traditions and values that the fallen star represents, because they have been willing to sacrifice convenience and comfort and immediate satisfaction to preserve something that matters more than any of these things. And in this persistence, in this stubborn refusal to compromise across 8,000 years, we might find something worth contemplating as we drift towards sleep, something about the possibility of maintaining integrity in a world that constantly pressures us to abandon it, about the value of standards even when they seem impossibly high, about the connections between past and present and future that give our lives meaning beyond the immediate moment. House Dayne and Dawn, the family and the blade, the tradition and the symbol, have endured across ages that would humble most human creations, and in their endurance we might find both inspiration and comfort, a reminder that some things persist, that some lights continue to shine even in the darkness, that some standards remain worth upholding even when the cost of upholding them is high. If you're finding these contemplative explorations of Westerosi history and politics a peaceful way to end your day, a like and subscribe really helps others discover these gentle journeys through the past. And to those already subscribed, thank you for being part of this community of those who find comfort in slowly unfolding stories of power and patience, of roses growing strong through centuries of careful cultivation. As we near the end of our long exploration of House Dayne, and the sword that fell from the stars, it feels appropriate to step back even further from the specific events and individuals we have discussed, to consider what broader themes and lessons might emerge from this 8,000-year story, what insights we might draw from contemplating a family that has endured across such vast stretches of time, while maintaining traditions that most would have abandoned as impractical or impossible. The story of House Dayne is, at its heart, a story about the relationship between ideals and reality, about how humans create meaning in a world that does not inherently provide it, about the costs and benefits of holding to standards that transcend immediate self-interest. One of the most striking aspects of House Dayne's history is the tension between their legendary status and their relatively modest political power. They were never kings of all Dorne, never rulers of one of the great kingdoms, never holders of vast territories or commanders of enormous armies. In the grand political narrative of Westeros, where attention naturally focuses on the great houses that fought for the Iron Throne or ruled vast regions, House Dayne might seem like a minor player, a footnote to larger stories. And yet their reputation, their cultural significance, their impact on how people thought about honour and knighthood and nobility was enormous, disproportionate to their actual political authority. This suggests something important about the nature of influence and legacy. Power measured in armies and castles and control over territory is real and significant, certainly, but it is also transient, vulnerable to the fortunes of war and the competence or incompetence of individual rulers. The great kingdoms that existed in the Age of Heroes are gone, the petty kings who ruled them forgotten except as names in dusty chronicles. The Targaryen dynasty that seemed invincible when dragons filled the skies fell within 3 centuries, brought down by rebellion and the simple fact that dragons went extinct. Political power, no matter how overwhelming in the moment, rarely endures across the kinds of timescales we're discussing. But cultural power, the power of example and symbol and tradition, can persist in ways that political power cannot. House Dayne's commitment to honour, embodied in the tradition of the Sword of the Morning and in the insistence that Dorne could only be wielded by those who proved themselves worthy, created a kind of influence that outlasted many larger and more politically significant houses. They set a standard that others measured themselves against, provided an example of what nobility could mean beyond mere inherited privilege, demonstrated that it was possible to maintain integrity across ages that would have worn down lesser commitments. This raises interesting questions about what we value, what we consider important, what we hope will outlast our brief individual lives. If we measure significance purely in terms of power and wealth and political control, then House Dayne was never particularly significant, never among the first rank of Westerosi nobility. But if we measure significance in terms of cultural impact, in terms of providing examples and maintaining traditions and embodying ideals that inspire others, then House Dayne becomes far more important, becomes one of the houses that truly mattered in shaping how people thought about what nobility should mean. The relationship between legend and history in House Dayne's story is also worth contemplating. The origins of Dorne, the star falling from the sky in the Age of Heroes, the first swords of the morning whose names are lost to time, these elements are wrapped in myth and uncertainty, impossible to verify through the kind of evidence that historians prefer. We cannot know with certainty that a meteorite struck the Earth near Starfall 8,000 years ago, cannot prove that the blade was forged from celestial metal, cannot document the deeds of those ancient bearers of dawn, whose stories have been passed down through countless generations of retelling. But in some sense, the historical accuracy of these legends matters less than the fact that they have been believed and maintained, that they have shaped House Dayne's identity across millennia, that they have provided a framework of meaning that allowed the house to understand itself and its purpose. The legends are true in the sense that they are powerful, that they have had real effects in the world, that they have influenced how generations of Danes lived their lives and made their choices. Whether the star literally fell from the sky, or whether that is poetic language for something more mundane, the story has been real in its consequences, has created a tradition that has endured for 8,000 years. This suggests that the relationship between myth and reality is more complex than a simple binary of true or false. Real or invented. Myths can be true in important ways, even if they are not factually accurate, can carry wisdom and meaning that transcend their literal content, can shape reality through their influence on human behaviour and belief. The myth of the fallen star made House Dayne what they became, created the tradition of the Sword of the Morning, established the standards of worthiness that defined the house's identity. In this sense, the myth was productive, was creative, was real in the ways that matter most for human meaning and purpose. The burden that House Dayne placed on itself through its commitment to worthiness is worth considering as well. By insisting that Dawn could only be borne by those who proved themselves exceptional, the house created enormous pressure on each generation, ensured that many talented and capable individuals would nonetheless be judged insufficient, created periods of absence and incompleteness when no one could meet the standard. This was a heavy cost, a source of disappointment and perhaps even tragedy for those who aspired to be Sword of the Morning but fell short. We might ask whether this cost was worth paying, whether the benefits of maintaining such high standards outweighed the pain they caused. There is no simple answer to this question, no calculation we can perform that would definitively resolve the matter. But we might observe that the alternative, lowering the standards or abandoning them entirely, would have meant losing what made House Dayne special, would have reduced them to just another noble house with a famous sword rather than a house that embodied ideals worth aspiring to. The cost was real, but the value of what was preserved was also real, and House Dayne across 8,000 years judged the preservation worth the price. This kind of long-term thinking, the willingness to accept costs in the present to preserve something for the future, is rare and valuable. Most human institutions, most families, most organizations face constant pressure to compromise, to accept good enough rather than holding out for excellent, to prioritize immediate comfort over long-term integrity. House Dayne resisted these pressures generation after generation, maintained their standards even when doing so was painful, trusted that the tradition was worth preserving even through periods when it seemed dormant or impossible to maintain. The story of Arthur Dayne and his death at the Tower of Joy illustrates both the glory and the tragedy inherent in House Dayne's commitment to honour. Arthur was perhaps the finest knight of his generation, embodied the ideals of the Sword of the Morning more completely than almost anyone in the tradition's long history, and yet he died fighting for a lost cause, maintaining vows that had become divorced from any larger purpose. Standing at a remote tower while the kingdom he served collapsed around him, his death was simultaneously noble and futile, admirable and tragic, a testament to the complications and contradictions inherent in the concept of honour, when honour requires serving causes and people who may not deserve service. We might contemplate what Arthur's story teaches us about duty and conscience, about the relationship between our commitments and our judgment, about what we owe to the oaths we have taken when circumstances change in ways we did not anticipate. Arthur chose to honour his vows to Rhaegar even after Rhaegar was dead, chose to stand at the Tower of Joy even when the larger cause was lost. And this choice cost him his life. Was this admirable loyalty or foolish rigidity? Was he a model of constancy or a cautionary tale about the dangers of inflexibility? The answer probably depends on our own values and commitments, on what we believe honour requires in impossible situations. But perhaps the very ambiguity of Arthur's choices, the fact that reasonable people can disagree about whether his actions were wise or tragic, is itself instructive. It suggests that honour is not a simple matter of following rules, not a mechanical application of principles to situations, but rather a complex navigation of competing values and loyalties that sometimes cannot all be satisfied simultaneously. Arthur faced impossible choices and made the choices that seemed right to him, that aligned with his understanding of his duties and his identity. Whether we would have made the same choices is less important than recognizing that he faced genuine moral complexity and responded to it with courage and integrity, even if the specific choices he made are debatable. The common people of the Dane lands, those farmers and fishermen and craftsmen who appear only occasionally in our story, but whose lives provided the foundation for everything House Dayne achieved, deserve our consideration as well. They did not choose to be ruled by House Dayne, did not select the standards and traditions that their lords maintained, had little voice in the decisions that shaped their lives and their society. Yet they supported the house across 8,000 years, paid their taxes, provided their labour, fought in their lords' wars, took pride in the sword of the morning and the traditions that made their lords special. What did they receive in return for this support? Protection, certainly justice administered by lords who took their responsibilities seriously, a sense of identity and pride in belonging to the lands of an ancient and honourable house. Whether this was a fair exchange, whether the benefits justified the costs is another question without a simple answer. The feudal system was exploitative in fundamental ways, extracted labour and resources from the many to support the comfort and ambitions of the few. But within that system, being ruled by House Dayne was probably better than being ruled by many other houses, by lords who did not maintain the same standards of honour and justice, who did not feel bound by traditions that required them to actually be worthy of their positions. The relationship between House Dayne and the broader culture of Westeros also merits reflection. The Danes were simultaneously part of that culture, and apart from it, participating fully in the institutions of knighthood and nobility and chivalry, while also maintaining traditions that predated those institutions by thousands of years. They were Dornish, but also something older than Dorne. First men who had adapted to the Andal conquest and the Targaryen unification without losing their essential identity. This ability to exist in multiple cultural contexts simultaneously, to honour both ancient traditions and contemporary obligations, required a kind of sophisticated balance that many houses never achieved. We might also contemplate what House Dayne's story suggests about the nature of tradition itself, about how customs and practices persist across time and what purposes they serve. Traditions are often dismissed as mere habits, as practices maintained out of inertia rather than genuine value, as obstacles to progress and adaptation. But the tradition of the Sword of the Morning was not merely habit or inertia. It was a carefully maintained standard that required constant effort to uphold, that had to be actively renewed in each generation, that served clear purposes in preserving meaning and enforcing excellence. Good traditions, traditions worth maintaining, are not passive inheritances but active achievements, requiring dedication and sacrifice, and the willingness to place long-term value above short-term convenience. House Dayne's success in maintaining their traditions for 8,000 years suggests that they understood this, that they recognised the difference between empty formalism and a meaningful practice, that they were willing to do the work required to keep their traditions alive and vital rather than allowing them to decay into mere performance. The question of what happens when traditions die, when the last person who believes in them passes away, or when circumstances change so drastically that maintaining them becomes impossible, is raised by our uncertainty about Dorne's current status. If there is no longer a Sword of the Morning, if no one has proven worthy to bear Dorne since Arthur's death, does the tradition still exist in any meaningful sense? Or has it become merely historical, a thing that used to matter but no longer does? A practice that belonged to a dead past rather than a living present? This question touches on deeper issues about the relationship between continuity and change, about how much transformation a tradition can undergo while remaining recognisably itself, about when adaptation becomes abandonment. House Dayne across 8,000 years certainly changed in many ways, adopted new religions and new customs, integrated Andal and Targaryen influences while maintaining their core identity. But there may be limits to how much change is possible before something essential is lost, before the tradition becomes so attenuated that it is no longer meaningful even if it technically continues to exist. These are not questions with definitive answers, not problems that can be solved through logic or analysis. They are tensions that humans have always had to navigate, balances that must be struck differently in different circumstances and different eras. House Dayne's long history provides one extended example of how a family navigated these tensions, how they maintained identity while adapting to change, how they preserved what mattered while releasing what did not. Whether their approach was optimal, whether they got the balance right, is perhaps less important than the fact that they persisted, that they endured across 8 millennia, while many houses that might have seemed more powerful or more successful fell into obscurity or extinction. The metaphor of the fallen star that runs through House Dayne's story offers a final point for contemplation. Stars, we know from astronomy, are distant suns, massive spheres of burning gas held together by gravity, fusing hydrogen into heavier elements and radiating energy into the void. When small pieces of stellar matter find their way to Earth, whether as meteorites or as the heavier elements forged in stellar cores and distributed through space by supernovae, they connect our world to the cosmos, bring the products of stellar processes into the realm of human experience. We are quite literally made of stardust, our bodies composed of elements that could only be created in the hearts of stars. In this sense, the story of a star falling from the sky and becoming a sword is not merely myth or metaphor, but a poetic expression of a deep truth about the relationship between Earth and cosmos, between human and stellar, between the everyday world we inhabit and the vast universe that contains it. We are connected to the stars not just metaphorically but materially, not just through imagination, but through the very substance of which we are made. House Dayne's claim to a connection with the stars, their possession of a blade forged from celestial metal, makes literal and visible a connection that exists for all of us, but that we rarely acknowledge or contemplate. And perhaps this is part of what makes their story compelling. What gives it resonance beyond the specific details of medieval politics and knightly combat? It speaks to something universal, to the human need to feel connected to something larger than ourselves, to find meaning in a universe that is vast and indifferent, to create traditions and standards and ideals that transcend our brief individual lives. The star fell, the sword was forged, the tradition was established, and for 8,000 years House Dayne maintained it, kept alive this connection to something cosmic and eternal, reminded themselves and those who heard their story that we are part of something larger, that the light of distant stars reaches us across unimaginable gulfs of space and time, that we can create meaning even in the face of an indifferent universe. As we drift toward the conclusion of this long contemplation, these are perhaps the thoughts worth carrying with us. That traditions can persist across timescales that humble individual ambition, that standards are worth maintaining even when maintaining them is costly, that ideals matter even when we fail to achieve them, that connections to the past and to the cosmos can give meaning to our present, that some lights continue to shine across ages of darkness. House Dayne and their fallen star have been shining for 8,000 years, and perhaps they will shine for 8,000 more, or perhaps their light has already faded and what we see is merely the echo of something that once was. Either way, the story endures, the lessons persist, the example remains for those who choose to contemplate it. We've travelled together through a long history tonight, drifted through 8,000 years of stories about a house and a sword, and the people who bore both across ages that would humble most human endeavours. We've contemplated stars falling from the sky, knights maintaining impossible standards, traditions persisting through conquest and change and loss. We've seen how meaning can be created and maintained across gulfs of time that dwarf our individual lives, how ideals can shape reality even when they are never perfectly achieved, how light can continue to shine even through the longest darkness. House Dayne and their pale blade wait still at starfall, whether wielded now or resting in silence, patient and eternal as they have always been. The Torrentine still flows to the sea, carrying with it the whispers of 8 millennia, the memories of all those who lived and died along its banks, who looked up at the stars and wondered about their connection to that light that fell so long ago. You've been part of this story tonight, have walked with me through these halls of memory and legend, and I'm grateful for your company on this journey. Wherever you are now, I hope you're warm and comfortable. I hope your breathing has slowed and deepened. I hope the day's concerns have faded like stars at dawn. Let the story drift away now if it wishes. Let your thoughts grow quiet and scattered like leaves on water. The fallen star has been waiting for 8,000 years. It can wait a little longer. For now, there is only rest, only the gentle dark, only the soft descent into dreams. The night is dark and full of rest. Sleep well.